Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to go over the last fallacy of the chapter, which I call subjectivity fallacy. And this is actually going to be the second half of what I wanted to talk about in the last video. So I talked about last video how it would have just been too much information to include it all in one video. But even after everything we covered in the last video, there's still a component of all of it that I didn't really cover yet. So that's what I want to talk about in this video. So just to basically make a short recap, so in the last video we talked about supernatural fallacy, right, which is basically the fallacy that atheists will often engage in, which means they will generally say that there's no such thing as a supernatural or there's no supernatural phenomena, right? That isn't true. There's plenty of supernatural phenomena. We see them all the time, right? When they're saying that, they usually will play fast and loose with the definition of knowing something. We don't really know if this stuff is supernatural, right? We don't really know if God exists. What they mean is they generally mean we don't know relative to an absolute standard, right? There's nothing we can know absolutely except for the fact that we exist. That's pretty much it, right? When we say we know something is supernatural or we know there's a God, we mean relative to a particular standard, right? So the standard, and we talked about that standard last video, right? So we have a theory, that theory makes predictions, and those predictions can be verified by ourselves and others. And supernatural phenomena also have the property that they can't be explained in physical laws, right? So if you have a theory and that theory makes verifiable predictions, you have to basically trust whatever that theory says. If the theory says that something is supernatural and then goes on to make predictions and those predictions seem to be true, then you got to accept that they're supernatural, right? So and by the way, that's actually how science works as well. So when we say we know something is supernatural, we mean relative to this theory that we're able to verify, right? Now, atheists don't do that. They don't have any theories. They don't make any predictions. All they do, well, they do make predictions, right? But they'll make a prediction, but the moment that they make a prediction that actually deviates from the dualist model, it fails. It always fails. It fails every single time. And then when that happens, they just engage in denialism. So they'll basically come up with some excuse why whatever supernatural experience happened, it didn't really happen for some reason. There was some more physical sort of event that occurred that we just don't know for some reason. And science will one day figure it out, which is science of gaps. Right? So that's basically a recap of pretty much what they do with every supernatural event that's given to them, right? They just engage in denialism and don't make any predictions about anything, right? We just know that it wasn't supernatural because we know it wasn't supernatural, and one day science will tell us why we know that, right? But now what I want to talk about in this video is now I want to talk about kind of those same ideas, but I want to approach it from a slightly different angle. So what I want to talk about now, it has to do with something atheists will always say, right? So they'll always say this about God, right? They will always say, well, about God and supernatural events in general, they'll always talk about evidence, right? So they'll always say there's no evidence of God, or there's no evidence of supernatural, or there's no evidence that God was actually speaking to you. You can't know for sure that God was talking to you, and this and that, right? So they always talk about evidence, right? They want evidence. They will tell you that if you just give them evidence of God, then they'll believe. What is this evidence that you have? So this is something I want to now break down in this chapter, right? In this video, is this concept of evidence, this term evidence that they're talking about. What do they mean by this? What does it mean to say there's no evidence of this thing? Because it seems like there's a lot of evidence to me, right? In fact, that's kind of the thesis of this video. I want to show that when they use the term evidence, they're kind of playing fast and loose with that term too. They're not using it in a very scientific way, and they're actually wrong. There's plenty of evidence of God. In fact, it's all over the place, right? So that's kind of what I want to establish in this video. So in order to do that, in order to break down what's really going on when they say there's no evidence, you know me, I like to have very concise and complete definitions. So what does it mean to say that something's evidence? What are we actually saying when we use that term? What is evidence actually? So for me, when I think about it, evidence to me is just a piece of information that when you look at, it convinces you that something's true, right? It convinces you that, or it increases your conviction. It doesn't have to fully convince you, but it increases your conviction that something is true, or some theory is true, right? And so that piece of information can come in the form of It could come in the form of material, right? So I presented something to you, something physical, tangible. It can come in the form of logic, right? So just mathematical theorem, for example, can convince you that something's true. Or it could come in the form of experience, right? So something you experienced could convince you something's true. So it could come in different forms. But evidence is just something that convinces you something's true. So now what I want to talk about is I want to talk about something, I want to highlight a certain truth about the word evidence that although it's very obvious, I do think it gets overlooked, right? So I think it gets overlooked in everyday language and in terms of how we use this word. So I do think it's important to highlight it for this video. So what I've noticed is that when people use this term evidence, right? There's no evidence of a thing, or there is evidence of a thing. What they're kind of not, it doesn't seem like they're often recognizing is that evidence is really just an opinion, right? It's literally just a preference. It's no different than when I describe something as my favorite color, right? So for example, my favorite color is blue. Does that mean that blue is the best color in the universe and it's above all other colors, right? No, right? That's just my opinion. It's my preference, right? In fact, to go over this point here, it says evidence is not absolute. It's simply a preference. That's really all it is. In other words, when I use this term when I use this term evidence, it's my personal description of a piece of information I'm looking at, right? So if I look at a piece of information and I say, oh, this increases my conviction that some theory is true, or it increases my conviction that some belief is true, then I would describe that piece of information as evidence. Now, that's just my personal description. Again, no different than my personal description that something looks nice, right? Or that something tastes good, right? It's just an opinion. In fact, someone else can look at that same piece of information and say, they can not only conclude it isn't evidence or not describe it as evidence relative to some belief, they can say it increases their conviction that this belief is false, right? So that's as the opposite. It functions as evidence that the belief is false and not true. So the opposite of me, right? So in other words, it's literally just opinion. It doesn't really mean much, right? So when a person describes something as evidence, it's just a personal description. It doesn't really mean any much more than when a person describes something as their favorite color, right? And so evidence is very often used in an absolute context, as if when you describe a piece of information as evidence, there is some sort of intrinsic truth it now has. No, that isn't true. And the reason I bring that up, right, the reason I say that is to say I believe that's often how atheists will use this term evidence. There's no evidence of God. There's no evidence he spoke to you or that he's talked to you, right? There's no such thing as evidence of anything, right? If we really want to get down to it. So if we want to use evidence in this more absolute term, right? So what would absolute evidence be? Well, based on the definition, you could say absolute evidence would be evidence such that if I look at it, I absolutely have to be convinced. Or if I look at a piece of information, I absolutely have to be convinced that some theory or some belief is true, or my conviction that is true has to increase whether I like it to or not. If I looked at it, I got no choice. I got to be convinced, right? That's absolute evidence. Obviously, there's no such thing as absolute evidence in that form. There's any piece of information I can always look at and still just choose not to be convinced of it, right? Unless it take away my free will, kind of like I said before. And so this is very similar to what we saw with the definition of knowing, right? So in the previous video, I said atheists will often play fast and loose with this term knowing, right? So they'll say, oh, you can't know that God exists, or you can't know something is supernatural. No one can know anything except that they exist, right? There's we're incapable of knowing things absolutely, right? When we say we know things as relative to some particular standard, that's what we mean, right? They will often play fast and loose with this definition of knowing in a debate to sort of increase their standing or whatever, right? And they do the same thing with evidence, right? I believe they play fast and loose with the term evidence. In one instance, they're using evidence in an absolute way, and in another instance, they're using evidence in a relative way. No, you have to be consistent. There's no such thing as absolute evidence of anything, right? And when it comes to the concept of God, when they say there's no evidence of God, there's no evidence of this, they just mean in terms of their opinion, right? That doesn't really mean anything, right? So when we talked about knowing, like I said before, we talked about knowing in the previous video, we even though we can't know anything absolutely, what it did make sense to do, what we talked about, is it makes sense to pick a relatively rigorous sort of standard that we can use when we say we know something. Now, we can pick any standard we feel like for saying we know something, but we want a good one, right? We want a good one that we feel like sort of often gets us to the truth of reality, right? So we talked about that last video. So for new supernatural things, it was one property of something we say we know is true should have the property that can't be explained by physical laws, or even it violates physical laws, right? So that's for a supernatural phenomenon. And then the second property, we said we want a theory that describes this phenomenon. We want this theory to be able to make predictions about this phenomenon. And then those predictions have to be verifiable based on our experience and the experience of others, right? So if we see anything that such that could be said, then we can say we know something relative to that. That's a good standard to have for saying we know something, for saying we know something is true about reality. Well, that same standard, by the way, that's the standard they apply in science, so we showed that last video too, with the exception of the supernatural part, supernatural condition. But evidence pretty much follows that same thing, right? So we can say we know evidence is true relative to that standard, right? In other words, we want to pick a good standard for this term evidence. Even though it's always just our opinion, when we say something is evidence of a thing, we want to have a good standard for it, right? So that we can say if something's evidence relative to this standard, then we could trust that this is a good sort of piece of information to label as being convincing of some truth. Now, even though we can give that definition of it, I would still argue that evidence, actually no, the standard of evidence I just gave is the standard for science. Now in the courtroom, they would pick probably a different standard of evidence because they can't really do all of that, right? So there are different epistemological standards, right, for what would generally be considered a good structure for when we call something evidence, right? And so to go over here, it says evidence in the context of science is considered to be the best standard epistemologically, right? And so basically what I'm getting at there is just to say that even though evidence is always just going to be our opinion, a good standard to use such that we say this is evidence relative to the standard, the best standard to use really is the standard for science, right? So the standard for science, like I said, fits the standard I talked about in the last video. So now here's the thing. Now when an atheist says, oh, there's no evidence of this and there's no evidence of that, really it's really just their opinion, right? It's just their opinion. It's no different from anyone else's opinion. Two people could look at the same piece of evidence and have different opinions. Two people could look at the same pieces of information and come to different conclusions about whether to call it evidence for this or evidence against it, or whether to call it evidence at all, right? It's literally just an opinion. And actually, before I get into it, something I did want to say is if you think about a flat earther, right? So a flat earther and a scientist, or a person who believes the earth is round. A flat earther and a scientist can look at geological data. They can both look at the same geological data and they can both describe it as evidence of different things, right? So the scientist will say this is evidence the earth is round. The flat earther will look at the same piece of information and say this is evidence the earth is flat. So who is correct? Nobody, right? It's just an opinion. It doesn't mean anything. So it wouldn't make sense for the round earther to say that there's no evidence for the flat earther to say there's no evidence the earth is round, right? He doesn't really have the power to just say that, right? Another person could look at the same piece of evidence and say the earth is round, right? So it's just an opinion. It never leaves the scope of their opinion. When an atheist says, there's no evidence of God, it's just their opinion. There could be plenty of evidence to God to one person. In fact, they could be looking at the same piece of information. There's plenty of evidence of God to one person and not evidence of God to another. It doesn't mean anything. It's just an opinion. But what the atheist would say is that no, when I say there's no evidence of God, I'm using, the very rigorous. I'm saying it relative to a very rigorous standard, right? Which is not true, and that's kind of what I want to show in this video, right? It's not true when they say that they often, like I said before, atheists, they often like to use flowery language such as this is more logical and this is more scientific and this is more rational. No, all right. Like I said, I want to show that that's not true. They're not practicing science. It's not rational. It's not logical. It's fundamentally just faith. It's actually anti-science and anti-logic, in my opinion. So they always try to convince people that when they have this requirement of evidence, they're using kind of the same evidence standard for evidence that science uses, which is the highest one, right? So this is the more rational, the more logical, this is the true one, right? They would argue that everyone else who believes in God is using some random, lesser, not rigorous standard for when they say something is evidence of a thing. And I'm going to show it's in reverse. So in order to show that, to demonstrate that, I want to now just talk about something very quickly, right, as it relates to science. Right, so back in the day, right, so way back when, so in the early 20th century, 1900s, when quantum mechanics was being discovered, right? When quantum mechanics was being discovered, they started performing experiments to sort of, they started performing experiments that caused certain emissions of light to be shown in certain experiments. And they were trying to calculate, make certain calculations to be able to predict what they saw with the light emissions. And they noticed that was very difficult, right? It seems like the laws of the predictions of classical mechanics weren't quite matching up with what they were seeing in experiments. So long story short, eventually they discovered quantum mechanics. They realized that energy can only be emitted or absorbed in discrete amounts, discrete quanta, right, related to the photon and things like that. And eventually what they realized is that at the quantum level, right, certain observable values, they're called observables, which basically are just things you can measure about a quantum particle, like such as its position. They realized that before you actually take a measurement of a particle, a position, for example, of a particle is not well defined in nature, right? Now, it's important to recognize that, and this kind of confused people back in the day, right? Because at that time, this stuff was new, right? So what I'm going to say is very well accepted, doctrine now, right? But back then it was new, so they weren't really sure if they had it right. But what according to the experiment and the mathematics, it seemed to be that the particle itself has no clear position, right? It has no well-defined position before you measure it. Now, it might sound at first like I'm saying, well, no, it has a position, but, it's just hard to figure out what it is. If we have the perfect measuring device, then we can find out exactly what its position is, and then we can make an equation, right, that could calculate exactly where we would find it at a later time. Since we can't know its position before measuring it, there's really no way to sort of make an equation that's going to find out where it is. In fact, I should have mentioned that what they do in quantum mechanics, they have an equation that the best it can do is just give you the probability of where to find that particle, right? They can't really give an equation that tells you, okay, the particle is going to be right here, right? And it might sound like, oh, well, if you could measure that particle, if you could know exactly where that particle is before measuring it, right? At least before putting it into your equation and predicting where it's going to be, then you can predict it perfectly where it's going to be located. But what they realize is that no, it has nothing to do with our measuring device. We can have the most perfect measuring device ever, right? And we still couldn't predict precisely where the particle is, right? In terms of, and then make an equation to determine where it's going to be later, right? In other words, it doesn't have a well-defined position in nature, right? Nature itself has not given it a position, and that's why I can't develop an equation that tells me precisely where it is now and because I can't know precisely where it is now, I can't know precisely where it's going to be later. So that's something they realized, right? And that's very strange, right? What do you mean nature didn't give it a well-defined position? That's actually a product of the wave-particle duality. It actually functions more like a wave. A wave doesn't have a precise position. But that's what they realized. And they said that the particle, just nature doesn't give the particle precise position, right? Only when you measure it, then it gets a precise position, which is kind of strange, right? That's called, the interpretation, there are many different interpretations about why that happens. It's called wave function collapse is the most accepted one. But we're actually going to talk a little more about that in chapter 9. But there's no point, I don't need to go into too much of it now, but the point is that a lot of scientists couldn't really accept that, because basically what quantum mechanics was saying was that the best we can do is make an equation to give us the probability of where a particle is going to be located, right? In other words, it was indeterministic, right? And that was very different from classical mechanics, so the physics for the macroscopic world that they were used to. Classical mechanics is deterministic, meaning I can know exactly where a particle is, or some object that I'm making an equation for, and I can predict exactly where it's going to be later. I don't have to do probability or any of that, right? And so they basically were expecting that same type of behavior at the quantum realm, and they said, no, it's not like that. It's at some point when you're here, when you get small enough, now it just gets deterministic, right? And that's what they realized, right? And that was very strange. And Einstein was a scientist, famous scientist, right? He was a genius, but he's known for being wrong on this one, right? So he believed that no, right? Nature is not inherently indeterministic, right? He believed nature was deterministic. So he's classically or famously known for saying, which is not really exactly true, but the statement is famously attributed to him. The statement, God does not play dice, right? So in other words, what he's saying there is nature is not inherently probabilistic, right? There's something we don't know. There's the theory we have is incomplete. There's some information that we're missing, right? And sometimes this is called hidden variables, right? So as a good example of that, I'm kind of going into this longer than I wanted to, but if you could flip a coin, right? If you flipped a coin, now in theory, you're going to use probability to kind of analyze the odds of it, or what its odds are of landing on something, right? And generally, its odds are just going to be 50%. If something is wrong with the coin, though, the odds might change a little bit. But does that mean that the physics of the coin is probabilistic, right? It is impossible to calculate exactly what the coin will land on. Well, no, it's not really impossible, right? If you could account for the variables properly, if you accounted for exactly how much force you use to accelerate the object, and you made certain calculations about its rotations and the distance from this and that, right? You could calculate exactly what it's going to land on. But it's very difficult to sort of analyze all of those variables. It is certainly not worth it for much of the time, right? But what we would argue is that those variables that would allow us to perform that kind of calculation are what we would call hidden variables, or what's called in physics hidden variables. So if we had those hidden variables, we can make that calculation, and then we can perform a calculation based on about a coin flip that was no longer probabilistic, instead would be deterministic. But if we don't use all those hidden variables, then we're just going to stick to probability. It's much easier and much simpler. So, in quantum mechanics, there are some scientists, like Bohmian, I forget his name, Bohm, and then there's Bohmian, there's something called Bohmian mechanics, right? So he says that there are hidden variables, and if we just had them, then we can make a deterministic calculation about quantum particles. So, which I think turned out not to be true, right? It wasn't a strong theory, it's a very weak theory, and wasn't consistent. The Copenhagen interpretation, the idea of wave function collapse, was really the good one that had a lot of nice you could do a lot of nice things with. But I say all of that to say that Einstein found it difficult to accept that reality itself limited, right, the type of information he was allowed to get about it, right? Reality itself limited the type of information he was allowed to retrieve from it, right? And that was sort of very difficult to accept, right? But I don't know how much he worked on trying to find a deterministic sort of equation. I don't think he did too much. But I just say that he had a hard time, and some scientists really worked really hard. Now, all of the evidence pretty much supported the probabilistic interpretation of quantum mechanics. But a lot of scientists kept trying, and they kept looking, right, for this more deterministic equation. There got to be these hidden variables that we're not seeing, right? And Bohm was one of them, right? And like I said, I think even recently, it turned out Bohmian Kent actually was proven experiment not to be true, right? It is wrong, right? And so now, there's a reason I bring that up, but I want to now bring up another example, then I'll kind of say why I'm saying all of this. So, you probably know where I'm going with this, right? But, so Isaac Newton, another genius, right? So he was brilliant in mathematics, right? He ended up creating pretty much all of modern or classical physics, what we call now classical physics. But despite all of his brilliance, Isaac Newton, there was another thing that he was known to get wrong, right? Much worse than Einstein's case, right? He was known to be into alchemy, right? So alchemy, I don't even know what that is. I guess that's just implying magic or something, or supernaturalism to chemistry, right? So I think he spent the rest of his life almost, right, just focused on alchemy after, what he contributed to mathematics. Or more specifically, he spent way more time trying to learn alchemy and develop a theory of alchemy. He wrote a lot more, I think, about alchemy than mathematics and physics, right? And so now that's kind of strange, right? Because he's considered to be the father of modern science or something like that. How's he saying go? The laws of physics lay hidden in the night, and Sir Isaac Newton was born, and then all was light, or something like that, right? I remember hearing something like that as I was a kid. So he was a very smart guy, and he, by that time, they already established scientific method, right, in Europe and things like that. So I'm sure he knew of those principles. But for whatever reason, he kept wanting to believe in this thing, which I imagine he saw a lot of evidence. He had a lot of evidence that this thing wasn't true, right? This thing wasn't working, right? In other words, the science, right, was showing that there's no such thing as alchemy as he understood it and as he defined it. But what I imagine he must have kept going against what the science was telling him because he wanted this thing to be true very badly, right? He wanted there to be something missing or some hidden variable, right? There was some hidden variable that once uncovered would allow him to sort of study alchemy or develop alchemy and this and that, right? And so why do I bring all of this up? Well, the reason, let me say this first before I read this point. Basically, what I'm getting at is that there is often, and it's important to recognize this, right? That there can often be a very thin line between the standard of science when we use the term evidence, and then the standard of a personal preference when we use the term evidence, right? So it's not like if you try to present something as evidence and you say it's evidence relative to the scientific standard, which we talked about last video, right? It's not like if you're doing that, then there are such clear lines that it's very easy to use the term evidence in the context of science, right? No, right? Sometimes there's a very thin line and it gets blurry. Even if you're using it in the context of science, it can still very easily be a personal preference and not really science at all, right? And so that's actually what happened with Isaac Newton and to a lesser degree Einstein, right? But what I really want to talk about is this point, right? And it says part of science is accepting limits reality has placed on your ability to obtain knowledge, right? So that's a very important sort of thing to recognize, right? Super important. In fact, I think I mentioned last video that there was another tenet, right, of a good standard to have when we say we know something. This is actually part of it, right? This is another tenet we didn't talk about last video, but this is another tenet you want to have. When you say you know something, when you say you know something, it should be relative to not only what we said about a theory that makes predictions and those predictions match up with our experience and experience of others, but it should be something that accepts this as well, right? When we say we know something, we're acknowledging this component. Because reality will sometimes limit the information that's available to you. And part of engaging in the process of science is recognizing that, right? And some people have trouble doing that. when Einstein said that he believed that there were these hidden variables such that if we just uncovered them, then we can make a deterministic calculation about quantum particles. Now, he was actually a scientist. He didn't really insist on it. He didn't say quantum theory was wrong and this and that. And no, there's definitely hidden variables. I'm not believing any of it until I have this theory that has them. He didn't do that, right? But there were some, I believe there were some scientists, I don't know if there were scientists that did, but you can imagine if there were scientists that did that, then they wouldn't be practicing science, right? At what point could they be doing that where you now have to say they're no longer practicing science, right? So if I exist back then and I say no, right, this theory is crap, right? It doesn't make any sense to say that we can only make a deterministic calculation about particles, or that nature itself is probabilistic, and that's why we can only make probabilistic calculations. Imagine if I said, no, that's not true, I don't believe any of that, I'm going to keep looking for these hidden variables. By the way, there were scientists that tried to do that, right? They could never do it because it's not true, right? So, but if I did that, if I kept performing all these calculations and trying to use science and things like that, right, then one has to argue I'm practicing bad science, right? I'm not going to go further in the science and find these theories because it's wrong, right? It is not true. When scientists of the day were performing these calculations and creating quantum theory and running these experiments, they eventually had to accept this limit on reality, right? Reality will not let you know, right, what that particle is doing more than a certain amount before you measure it. And there's nothing you can do about it, right? And eventually scientists just had to accept that, right? And so they call it, like I said, it's called wave function collapse. When they measure, so the quantum particle is technically in a state of superposition. But for now, just say the quantum particle it's doing something, right? It is we don't know really what it's doing. It's fairly undefined, right? Certain parameters are not, they're defined, but they're not well defined, right? Relative to the particular observable. But for the moment, I'll just say they're not well defined before you measure it. Excuse me. So, like I was saying, the properties of a quantum particle are not well defined before you measure it, right? But they do become defined after you measure it. We don't know why that exists. Now, if we said that we're not going to accept this theory and we're just going to kind of stomp our feet and say no, right? We need to know why. I'm sure there are hidden variables somewhere. Then I'm not practicing real science because I'm not accepting the limit of truth reality has placed on me. What actual science did is when they realized this, they were like, hey, reality has limited my ability to know more information about it, right? And there's nothing I can do about it. So they just accepted it and started working from that, right? They started continuing on with studying quantum phenomena and trying to explain more. And eventually it led to quantum field theory, which is kind of like the successor of quantum mechanics and this amazing theory, right? And there are so many things they learned from accepting this truth. Even till today, this idea of a particle not being well defined before you measure it, it still holds up, right? Because that is true, right? It describes reality. So it would have been bad science to insist on something you just wanted to be true about the quantum realm, right? You could have colored your research and everything you're doing in flowery language and said it's more logical and it's more scientific and this and that, right? Why would quantum particles not be well defined? You can use all types of language like that, but you would have been wrong, right? Because you would have been looking for evidence that fits your personal preference, right? You wouldn't have been practicing science, which is about accepting that sometimes reality just limits the information that's available to you. Same thing with Sir Isaac Newton, right? So Isaac Newton, you can imagine, right? I don't know what his research was, but I imagine that much of his research must have been telling him, if he was acting according to science, he would have said, oh, the science is showing there's no such thing as alchemy, right? But he wasn't accepting that. Now, was he still engaging in what might seem like parallel scientific practices, right? Would he have been still doing things that seem like they contain the spirit of science? Sure, right? He still would have probably been using some type of mathematics, recording some type of data, performing experiments, comparing data to different things. He would have had a hypothesis and formulated theory, tried to formulate theories and things like that, right? So he would have still done all of that. So it would have looked a lot like science, right? But no, he was practicing bad science, right? What he was looking for was evidence according to his personal preference and not according to the rigorous standard of science. Otherwise, he would have concluded, based on the evidence, that there's no such thing as alchemy, right? Because if I use this term evidence, if I say something's evidence relative to the standard of science, right, then the evidence is there's no alchemy. But if I'm ignoring that standard, then for him there wasn't enough evidence to say there was no alchemy yet, and so he kept looking for it. So I say all that to say that there's a very thin line between sort of engaging in behaviors that contain the spirit of science. There's a very thin line between doing it according to science and then doing it according to personal preference. And more specifically, there's a thin line between calling something evidence in the spirit of science and calling something evidence relatively standard of your own personal preference, right? So now, why do I bring all of that up? I bring that up to say that, actually, no, before I get into it, I forgot, there's one other point I want to go over. And when so basically, just to reiterate, practicing science is about accepting when reality has limited your information, right? You can't just say because you want something to be true or it's more convenient for you if reality gives you information in a certain way, right? Well, only then does it count as evidence. No, that's not science, right? That's just a personal preference. And that's what atheists do. And I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But I want to make another thing clear about evidence relative to standard of personal preference, which is just an opinion, right? And to go over this, it says evidence as a personal preference can be restricted or loosened enough to make anything exist or not exist, right? So that's really important, right? Because evidence, if it's outside of science, if it's not relative to the standard of science, then it's just an opinion, right? And I can make anything exist or not exist. Or more specifically, I can make it so that there's no evidence of a thing, or there's no evidence that proves something is true, and there's no evidence that proves something isn't true. I can just define the term evidence and make it I can make my standard more and more strict, or I can make it more and more loose. So I can make anything in the universe not exist if I want to, right? Based on how I'm just randomly defining evidence, right? So let's say that I make the claim that the earth is flat, right? And you say, no, it's not, it's round. And I say, well, give me evidence that the earth is flat. And you say, well, there's plenty of evidence, right? There's the evidence of the rotation of the stars in the different hemispheres. There's evidence of, well, there's plenty of evidence, right? Line of sight if you look across the horizon. But let's say that you give me all these different forms of evidence, and I say, well, no, right? You can only give me evidence in this form, right? You have to, on the ground, you have to use, I don't know, binoculars or a telescope or whatever. You have to show me, because if the earth is round, then if I go far enough, I should lose line of sight because of the elevation of the earth, right? It's changing, it's a curve, right? But if it's not round, I should be able to maintain it and just see across the distance for a very long time, if not to the end of the planet, right, with the proper telescope. So imagine if I told you to show me that right here on the ground where we are, give me a telescope or show me a telescope, and when I look through it, I can see line of sight for as far as I can see. Well, no, that doesn't make any sense. There's plenty of things in the way, right? We're not in a sort of wasteland where there's nothing around, right? There are buildings everywhere. The line of sight will completely be blocked. I can't really prove to you the earth is flat in that way, right? And imagine if I said, well, hey, then if you can't prove to me the earth is round by that particular methodology in that particular way, then I'm just going to say you have no evidence the earth is round. I'm looking at the earth, it appears flat, that's good enough evidence to say the earth is flat, right? Well, that doesn't make any sense, right? I just, what you would say is that I'm not doing it in a logical or rational way. The way I'm describing evidence, right, is not rational. More specifically, I'm not doing it in a scientific way, right? But we're not talking about a scientific way, right? We're talking about evidence according to my personal preference. Notice that if I just restricted the manner in with which you're able to provide evidence, I made it so that there's no way you can prove to me, there's no way you can provide evidence to me that the earth is round. Now, by the same token, I can go in reverse. I can loosen up my definition of evidence and make it so that there's virtually no way to prove to me that something isn't real, right? So as an example, let's say I come up with the theory that there's no gravity, right? Which this is actually a thing, right? So I come up with the theory that there's no gravity and that actually everything we think is due to gravity is just due to electromagnetism, right? That's actually called the theory of the electric universe or something like that. Which obviously makes no sense, right? Most matter is neutral, right? At least that we deal with here. And it's completely unaffected by, there's no electric field around to cause it to do anything, and it's not affected by electric field. Why on earth would an electric field be causing it to do all these things? And there's no electric field around anyway, right? They mostly talk about it in the context of the larger universe, but then how do you explain gravity here? It makes no sense. But there are people who believe in this, right? It's called theory of the electric universe. Now, for them, they would say all of these things are evidence that the universe is actually electric, right? So their definition of evidence is extremely loose, right? So it's very easy for now everything to be due to an electric charge, right? Everything you see is evidence that electromagnetism is the most, how do I want to word it? That what we think of being due to gravity is actually due to electromagnetism. So you see that this is a problem, right? You see this is a kind of a, now they would use all this flowery language of science too. Oh, this is more scientific and this is more rational and look at these equations and this and that, right? So like I said, there's a very thin line between using this term evidence relative to the standard of science and using the term evidence relative to personal preference, right? When it's personal preference, I can color it in the language of science and I can pretend like I'm using scientific principles, but the moment I leave the actual standard of science and I get to personal preference, then I'm almost like in crackpot territory, right? And this is where you get these sort of, maybe I shouldn't use the word crackpot, but this is where you get in these kind of territory when you get into like pseudoscience, right? And then that's the flat earthers and that's electric universe and stuff like that. And so, just to be clear, I'll say it again, I can make anything not exist, or I can make it so that you can't possibly give me evidence of anything if I just make my definition of evidence restricted enough. Or there could be evidence of everything if I just make my definition of evidence loosened enough. It's my personal preference, right? So I'm always allowed to do that the second I go outside of the more rigorous standard of science. So why do I bring all of that up? Well, you can probably guess why. To go over this point, it says atheists talk about evidence as a personal preference and not science, right? So that is super important. This is what I wanted to talk about in this video, right? Which again, it would have been too much to include in the previous video. When atheists say that there's no evidence of God, what they really mean is evidence according to their own personal preference. But like I said, if I'm just using my preference, I can make anything not exist. No matter what it is, I can just restrict my definition of evidence enough so that there's no way you can prove to me anything exists. I can make it so you can't prove to me we exist in the Milky Way galaxy, right? All I got to do is make my definition of evidence restricted enough, and then there's nothing you can do to prove it, right? So that's what atheists do, right? They're just picking, when they talk about evidence, they just mean their own personal opinion about what would count as evidence of God, or what would count as evidence of the supernatural. It's not really science. Like the flat earthers or electric universers or whatever, they can color what they're saying in flowery sort of scientific language. The other ones do the same exact thing, right? But like I said, there's a thin line between evidence in the form of science and evidence as a personal preference. And the second you leave evidence in the form of science, you can just pick whatever standard and whatever sort of restrictions or loosen whatever restrictions you feel like to make anything exist or not exist. So when atheists say there's no evidence of these things, it's just their opinion. They mean relative to their own personal opinion, right? They're not convinced. Now they are allowed, no problem, right? They are allowed to say, well, for me, right, personally, I would need to see this or that to believe that something is true evidence of God. No problem, right? That's fine. Everyone has their own sort of standard of what counts as evidence or not. However, when you say that, now you have relinquished, right, saying something's evidence relative to the standard of science, which is the more rigorous one. And this is what I'm talking about. Atheists don't practice science. They're just talking about their own personal preferences. They always try to convince people what they're doing is more scientific and it's more rational. No, I've never been convinced of that for 1 second in my entire life, right? I didn't need all these ideas, right? Like when I was younger, I thought I put atheists in the exact same box I do now, right? None of this stuff has made me more convinced that atheists aren't telling the truth, or their ideas are sort of more, I haven't been convinced more that their ideas are irrational. None of this stuff has convinced me more because I never needed more convincing. I always put them in the exact same box. I did, and nothing's really changed. Gaining more information about God and about reality, learning about the subconscious, having the supernatural experience with God, none of it has sort of really increased my conviction about how I perceive atheists that much, because it was always the same, right? But what atheists will often do, just like the flat earther, just like the electric universer, they will use flowery language because what they're saying is close to science, right? So it seems like, oh, they're using science. No, they're not, right? They aren't using science, right? So they're just using their own personal preference, and I can make anything exist or not exist using my defining evidence according to my personal preference. That's all they're doing. Now, of course, what the atheist will say is, no, I'm not doing according to my personal preference. I'm also using the standard of science. So I'm using a sort of rigorous sort of standard that sort of removes all these personal preferences and is a good standard that we can use to say that something's evidence of the truth, right? Because they'll say, oh, spiritual people use God of gaps argument, right? So if there's something they can't explain, they just attribute it to God. And there's examples of that throughout history, of course, right? From today to ancient times where the church in medieval times would say, oh, if there's sickness in the land or something, or if you're sick, it's because you didn't give the church enough money, or something like that. So I know that also happens with people who believe in God, or just spiritual people, right? They will loosen up the definition of evidence so that anything is evidence of God, right? So they'll say that, no, we're using the standard of science to remove all of these personal preferences that aren't good when it comes to having a standard for when evidence counts as the truth. They would say they're placing certain restrictions on evidence that are in line with the same restrictions that the standard of science uses, such that if you can present evidence to me of God that matches this standard, then I'll believe in God. So that's what an atheist would tell you. Now, I'm going to tell you that no, they're still not doing that. They might try to convince others that's what they're doing, but they're not. So why aren't they doing that, right? Certainly, when I describe it that way, seems rational enough, right? They just want to make sure that their definition of evidence is not too loose, right? So they're picking the standard they would claim they're picking the standard of science. Well, the problem with that has to do with what I was talking about earlier, right? It has to do with this part here. So part of science is accepting the limits reality has placed on you, right? Like I said before, it is bad science to not accept that. Sometimes in practicing science, you have to sometimes recognize that reality has just limited the information you're allowed to get, or the way you're allowed to get that information. And there's nothing you can do about it. If you're practicing true science and you're going to accept that, just try to work around it. You're going to do your best to get information after that limitation, which is exactly what they do in quantum mechanics. Right? So I argue that the same thing is true of God. In other words, God himself has limited the way we're able to obtain information about him, right? And so if I'm practicing bad science, then I'm just going to I'm going to place whatever random condition I feel like on God and say, no, in order for you to exist, I need to see evidence in this form, otherwise you can't exist at all, right? That's what a hard atheist will say, right? Because they claim there is no God. So a hard atheist would say, unless God exists with the condition I have randomly just placed on him for no reason, right, then he can't exist at all. And if he does exist, then he can only exist with the condition I've placed on him, which says that evidence or information about that proves he exists must come in this random form I just dictated in my head, right? In other words, it has to come in a form that I would claim is more aligned with a form of science. But it's perfectly possible that God can exist, and he chooses not to do that, right? So now, if I say it's possible God exists and chooses not to do that, well, that's not really evidence that he has, but we have to recognize that maybe that's the case, right? It's possible that God has simply chosen to give us evidence in a different form, right? He's unwilling to give us evidence in the form that we would prefer or that we would like, right? Just like when it comes to science and quantum mechanics, right? We would like to be able to get all the information about the quantum particle before measuring, or really I should say, we would like to be able to have an equation that tells us exactly where the quantum particle is going to be in a deterministic way, right? We would love that, right? But nature won't allow it. There's nothing we can do about it. We just have to accept that, right? If God is a being who will only give us evidence of himself in a certain way, then there's nothing we can do about it, right? We just have to accept it, work around that limitation, and try to get evidence of God in the manner that he has allowed us to. By the way, that's actually how it is. He tells us all the time in near-death experiences that that's what he's doing. And not just near-death experiences. I forgot to mention before, near-death experiences are a very small amount of spiritual experiences. Nothing special about them, right? That's just one of the ways God communicates with people. People have spiritual experiences all the time, right? Sometimes in dreams, sometimes in real worlds around them, they'll have a supernatural experience. He tells us all the time that's what he's doing. Atheists, of course, will just see all the people who have these spiritual experiences and say they're all delusional, they're all imagining it, they're all lying, it's all in their head, they're all hallucinating, and this and that. And then they'll just go back to saying there is no God, there's no evidence of him, right? Which makes no sense. But let's for the moment say that my claim is correct. Let's say that God does exist and he has limited the way he's going to give us evidence of himself, right? Like I say, he tells us why he does that. But let's say that's true. Then if I'm practicing real science, right, then I have to work around that limit and try to get information about him in the manner he has been willing to give us information. If I simply dictate no, right, if I stomp my feet and say no, I only want evidence in this form, and I say God can't exist unless he's willing to give me evidence in the form I demanded. Well, that doesn't make any sense, right? That, again, that's a personal preference. That's not science at all. But I want to analyze this sort of new foundation even further. If God is only willing to give us evidence in certain forms, then what more can we now say? Where do we go with that sort of understanding? Well, the first thing I want to acknowledge is that it doesn't seem like God is willing to give us evidence in a more observable way in the physical world. In other words, if a person says, throw a lightning bolt across the sky, he doesn't seem willing to do that, right? So he is unwilling to sort of throw a lightning bolt across the sky or perform some sort of magical act for us to demonstrate his existence. But what we do recognize, what does seem to be the case, is he does seem to be willing to give us evidence of himself through personal experiences, right? And this is where people have personal testimony and personal revelation about God, and they have personal experiences. I've had many personal experiences with God and Jesus Christ. So it's not like it's not the case that no one says, oh, I spoke to God and I had a supernatural experience with God and this and that, right? Many people have done. In fact, it happens every day, right? Near-death experiences, spiritual experiences. People have experiences with Jesus all the time, right? So previously, I said that if there exists a universe with a being with the property that they created the universe, or if this being exists, right, then we don't really know for sure what other properties are necessarily true if that being exists. But we do see a lot of events that are consistent with the idea that this being exists, right? There are all these experiences that shouldn't really be happening if there wasn't a being with that property that existed, right? So there are all these supernatural experiences with God. So even though we don't see God throwing lightning bolts for everyone all the time, we do see God giving people spiritual experiences all the time. That happens every day. So if that's just the manner he's willing to give us information, that happens all the time. So would it make sense to say there's no evidence of God if that's the manner he's willing to give us information, right? If that's my theory that he's willing to give us information in the form of personal experience, then the data the data that you see perfectly shows my theory is correct, right? But I want to go into that a little further. So now I want to acknowledge something very interesting about the nature of knowledge, right? The nature of knowledge about reality, right? So I want to sort of establish in a slightly more systemic and rigorous way. So to go over this point, it says, objective knowledge falls into two main categories: objectively verifiable phenomena and subjectively verifiable phenomena. So I don't know what the actual term is in epistemology and this and that, right? So, but these are just the terms I make up for. So what is this saying, right? Well, what I mean is that reality contains information, right? So anything that exists in reality is a piece of information, and we can say I'm talking about objectively true information. So this is information that's not based on my opinion. It doesn't change based on how I feel, right? It is completely invariant under personal belief or custom, right? Meaning that it is a truth about reality that is unchanging, right? It has nothing to do with what a person believes or wants to be true. So if you just take all the knowledge in reality, right, that's objectively true about it, I find it useful to recognize or categorize it as falling into two main categories. So one of those categories is objectively verifiable phenomena. So what does that mean? Objectively verifiable phenomena consist of our phenomena that demonstrates knowledge about reality or truth about reality that can be demonstrated regardless in a way that has nothing to do with what a person believes or what they want to be true or their feelings or anything like that, right? So I can objectively demonstrate it in the real world empirically, right? With 100% empiricism. And I'll talk about why I use it, why I say it that way in a moment or a little bit later. But so that's basically what science is, right? So science tries to talk about the truth of nature, the truths of how nature operates. And pretty much all of it, right? All of what we consider to be physics it's generally accepted theories in physics. All of it can be demonstrated as objectively verifiable phenomena, right? I can verify these truths about reality. So the theory of quantum mechanics, the theory of classical mechanics, the ideas about chemistry, biology. I can demonstrate all of these things in a purely objective way. It has nothing to do with what I believe or what I want to be true or what I hope to be true. And according to one of these tenets of science, it's reproducible, right? So I should say, if it is completely invariant under personal belief or custom, then it should be completely reproducible from person to person, which is true, right? That's how science is. If I perform an experiment to test the truth of Isaac Newton or Lagrangian mechanics, right, I can perform a calculation here, starting with an experiment that has some variables for some object, and I can perform calculations and verify that Lagrangian mechanics is correct, right? Now, another person across the planet could do the exact same thing with the exact same object, the exact same equation, and come to the exact same conclusion. They can demonstrate that in Lagrangian mechanics, not that super important, but using Lagrangian mechanics, you can set up the equation of motion and show that using Lagrangian, that the path the object takes is always going to follow the path of least resistance, right? Or something that minimizes a path that minimizes the action, right? So that's basically Lagrangian mechanics. So I can demonstrate it objectifiably. It's completely invariant under who's doing it, what their beliefs are, what their personal preferences are, things like that. And I can measure these things with an instrument, right? So it's not even based on my sensory perception. I can use an instrument and measure it, right? It's dependent on my sensory perception, to the extent that I have to look at the instrument or perceive the instrument. But beyond that, right, beyond that, it is objectively verifiable, right? So that's basically how science is. That's basically how science is. So now I want to talk about subjectively verifiable phenomena. So subjectively verifiable phenomena, those would be phenomena that contain information, so true objective information about reality, or objectively true information about reality. It contains information that can only be verified subjectively. Or in other words, I can only verify it's true to myself, right? So Now, you probably don't hear about information kind of broken up that way, but I do think it is important to acknowledge that in this particular context, right? So what's an example of a subjectively verifiable phenomenon? Well, my experience, right? So if I poke myself, right, and I experience pain, well, that's a subjectively verifiable phenomenon. What that means is that I'm the only one who could verify the truth that I experienced pain. Right? No one else can know that, right? And this is actually an issue when it comes to prescribing medicine, right? Now you might say, well, no, we can use biometric data, right? So we can take measurements of the body. We can see that a pain receptor is firing, and then we can know that a person is experiencing pain in that case. But that's not an exact science, right? Something could go wrong, right? We don't know everything about the brain, right? So I can even use that, right? A pain receptor can seem like it's firing like crazy and a person still doesn't feel much pain for whatever reason. It could be firing and the person doesn't feel any pain. For whatever reason, the signal just doesn't go all the way. Who knows why? It can not seem like it's firing very much, but for whatever reason, a person feels a lot of pain. So it's not an exact science, right? You can even have presumably a dead body and make a pain receptor fire, right? So no matter how much we want to sort of use biometric data as an inference of pain, it still doesn't really mean anything. Not to mention, the only reason we even presume pain receptors that when they're firing, it must mean someone is experiencing pain is because we're going by information that comes from other people, right? Who were just saying what happens when there was some computer, I imagine, I don't know the history, but I imagine there was some computer that got data about some pain receptor firing. I don't know if they can measure it in that way. I should have looked it up, but I assume maybe they can measure it in some way, right? But if some pain receptor is firing, we only know or presume this corresponds to an experience of pain because we asked someone, right? We asked someone because it was subjectively verifiable. They were the only ones who could verify what's happening when this pain receptor is firing, right? So, in other words, no matter what is happening, no matter what we're measuring, right? At the end of the day, only the person can verify what's actually happening, right? And it is objectively true information because it doesn't matter how badly I don't want to feel pain or how convenient it would be if I stopped feeling it. No matter what I believe or want to be true, I'm still going to feel it, whether I like it or not, right? If my body's damaged, for example. So that would be an example of a subjectively verifiable phenomenon, right? And what I was going to say, in medical science or medicine, when they're prescribing painkillers like Oxycontin and things like that, right? A lot of times a person will just say they're in pain, right? So if they're becoming addicted or if they are addicted to it, they might just tell the doctor, I'm in pain, even if they're not, right? How could a doctor know? There's really nothing he can do, no matter what measurements he takes, no matter what he does, he can't really know for sure if this person is in pain or not, or how much pain they're in, more specifically. Now, why? Because the pain they experience is subjectively verifiable, right? There's a truth in reality. The objective truth of reality is that this person is experiencing pain to some degree, right? Or the objective truth in reality is this person's experience of pain, right? But no one else can obtain that truth of reality except that person, right? It's only subjectively verifiable, right? So there's nothing a doctor really can do, right? And so sometimes doctors just have to make the call whether this person's telling the truth or not. There's nothing they can do to verify what that person is saying. Now, if that person was to say something else, like, oh, my insulin levels are very high or something, well, that's objectively verifiable, right? I can literally just take a measurement and see if your insulin levels are high and make a determination based on that, regardless of what you're saying, right? Or let's say they work out and they want to take more testosterone. Their testosterone is small or it's a low level. Well, no, I can just take a sample of your blood and measure how much testosterone is in your blood. I don't got to listen to you, right? But pain is different. So that the measurement of testosterone in your blood is objectively verifiable. The pain they experience is subjectively verifiable. Sometimes a person will experience pain and the doctor doesn't know why they're experiencing pain, right? So it's important to realize that some information, objectively true information about reality, is objectively verifiable and some of it is subjectively verifiable, right? So a good example of that actually is what I was saying about the subconscious, right? So Everything we've been studying about the subconscious in all of book 1 and up until now, that's a subjectively verifiable phenomenon. There's nothing I can do. In fact, I can't even really be sure that your subconscious works the same as mine. I'm just assuming it does, right? You're the only one who can actually verify that your subconscious works according to all the rules that I've been saying. I'm the one who verified my subconscious works to all the rules I've been saying. I can't put my subconscious on a table and use instruments to measure it and confirm, according to those measurements, our subconscious works the same, right? So the nature of the subconscious is a subjectively verifiable phenomena, but it is still an objective truth about reality, right? Although my subconscious responds to my thoughts, it only responds to a degree. There's certain aspects of its operation that have nothing to do with what I believe or what I want to be true or what I hope to be true, right? So we talked about that with the absolute nature of the subconscious as well as quantization, right? So if I produce a particular intention, let's say I produce an intention that God has matched up with the sort of humor frequency. So if I produce this intention, my subconscious causes me to laugh, right? There's nothing I can do to make it so that intention now causes me to be sad instead or something, right? That absolute nature reflects the objectively true nature of the subconscious. But that objectively true information can only be verified subjectively. So that's the difference between the two. Now, just to go over this, from that analysis, we recognize something very interesting about subjectively verifiable phenomenon, right? Because let's say that we want to really now get into it. We really want to start studying these phenomena, and we want to try to approach them more from the perspective of science, right? Because what is science? It's like I said before, for some people, science is only objectively verifiable phenomena, right? You can't call it science unless it's information that I can retrieve using instruments or verify using instruments. My opinion is completely out of the equation and it's reproducible. I can get the exact same results with the same independent variables anywhere on the planet, right? And in any time, right? In history. So some people have that very strict definition of science, which I'm very sympathetic to. I understand why they would do that. There is, I suppose, a utility in differentiating between that kind of science and the kind that isn't like that. But for me, like I said before, I use the term science in a looser way, right? What I really like to get at is the spirit of science, which is just having a very rigorous process for obtaining the truth of reality. So if we have truth that exists somewhere in reality, but it's only subjectively verifiable, can we really come up with a scientific standard, a very rigorous standard or process for obtaining that truth in reality in a way that really prevents a lot of conditions or added sort of, or put another way, it allows us to get evidence in a way that's not too loose and is not too restricted, right? Science is about having evidence in just the right way, just the right manner. But this is much harder, right? Subjectively verifiable phenomena is much harder to do that because only people can verify it, right? I can't put it on the table and verify it with instruments. At the same time, I still want that objectively true information about reality. That's what science is about, getting information about reality. So can we come up with a scientific process for subjectively verifiable phenomena, right? Such that we can say evidence for these phenomena follows the standard of science, and we can trust that this represents some truth. This is reasonable to believe in some truth about reality based on this evidence. So it's like I said, it's much harder to do, but I still think it makes sense to try to do that. We got to look for a scientific way for obtaining truth for subjectively verifiable phenomena. Well, to go over this point, there's one thing we recognize that's very clear, right? It says the study of I just put SGP, but the study of subjectively verifiable phenomena will always depend on the veracity of personal testimony, right? So there's a reason I word it that way, but it'll always depend on the veracity of personal testimony, and we must accept a natural margin of error due to human error. So this is very important. So if we're talking about information that only exists in the subjectively verifiable realm, right? then we've got no choice but to study it simply by asking people what they experienced, right? Because only that truth of reality can only be verified by their experience, and they're the only ones that have it, right? I can't read their minds, and there's no instrument to go inside their minds and get that information, so I got no choice but to ask them. But that's a problem too, right? Because now we're inducing the problem of human error. A person can have a particular experience, and if I'm asking them questions, they can simply lie to me. They can lie to me, they can not remember, or they can misremember. They could say something that's true that, they can say something true that even goes against what they're remembering for some reason. For some reason, they can just do that. They're not articulating their ideas well, or if they misspeak, right? So there are all kinds of problems that are involved in trying to get information that depends on a person's sort of personal afflictions, right? Or probably a better word would be it depends on their sort of personal belief or custom or their personal way of doing things. And that's exactly what in physics you want to avoid, right? But you can only avoid it with some objectively verifiable phenomena, with truth that falls under that category. You can't do it with the other category. And so that's why I say you got no choice, right? You got no choice but to accept the margin of error, because there's always going to be a margin of error if I'm trying to get truth through other people's experiences and by asking them questions. Like I said, they can literally just lie to me and hide the truth from me. They could just make something up. Or even if they're not doing that, like I said, they can misremember or misspeak or not articulate their ideas well, use the wrong words, all types of things. So that's always going to be a problem with getting information in that way. But guess what? That's a part of science. Like I said, science is about accepting the limits that reality has placed on you for obtaining information. So practicing good science, if you're practicing good science, you're just going to accept that problem, that margin of error when it comes to subjectively true, verifiable phenomena, right? And now if you're practicing bad science, then you're going to say, no, I don't care, right? That it doesn't seem like I can get this information in an objective way, and I can only get it through other people's experiences. I don't care. I'm not going to study any of this, and there's no evidence of any truth that exists in the subjectively verifiable realm unless I can put it on a table and measure it with instruments. If I can't do that, there's no evidence of anything and it doesn't exist, right? That doesn't make any sense. That's complete nonsense, right? That's what someone would do if they're not practicing science. So to have a good stance, to have a standard of science for obtaining the truth of reality for subjectively verifiable phenomenon, we're just going to have to ask people what they experience, and we're going to have to accept that some of it's going to have error, or there's going to be an error problem with it, a margin of error, a deviation of some degree from the truth. Now, to go over this next point, it says, if a theory we have a theory about a subjectively verifiable phenomenon, if our theory is correct. So if we have a theory that describes some phenomena in reality, so there's some truth in reality, there's something going on in reality that I can only verify through experience. If I have a theory about how that thing works, which in this case we could just say the theory of the subconscious, right? So the one we've been talking about the whole time. The subconscious is a subjectively verifiable phenomena. It's a truth of reality that can only be verified subjectively. Let's say I have a theory about such a thing. If my theory is correct, then we should expect a trend of commonalities in reported testimonies of people who engage in particular behaviors suggested by the theory. This is what I call semi-empirical data or semi-empiricism. So basically what I'm getting at there is going back to the standard we talked about before. So if a theory, a good standard for science, right, to say we know something relative to, I'll say it again, I said it many times, right, is to say that we know something's true. When we say we know something's true, it's relative to a theory that describes something. That theory makes predictions about what that thing will do if we behave in a certain way or do certain things. And I can verify the truth of that theory by my own experience, and other people can verify it by their experience. So that's a good standard to have epistemologically, right? Epistemologically, if I'm saying that right. So you can do the exact same thing with subjectively verifiable phenomena. So I have a theory about the subconscious, right? I say if you do certain things with your intention, right, then the subconscious should do this, or you should have a certain type of experience. So I have a theory that describes a phenomena and it makes a prediction about what will happen if you do certain things. Now, if my theory is correct, exactly like it says, if I ask you, well, if you did this with your intention, if you held an intention and entered a transcendental state and told this kind of story and deep charged it or did it over and over in the course of 7 days, did you feel this more and more, right? So that would be how you verify my theory. Now, if my theory is correct, because I can't just know it's correct just because I do it, right? I do it all the time, so I verify this truth to myself, but it's not a good standard to have to say you know something just for my truth, or just because you verified it. It's good if other people can verify it too. So if my theory is correct, and I ask a whole bunch of people, right, if they did all these things, did they feel this thing that my theory predicts? If my theory is correct, then I should notice a trend in all of these reports. If I set up a series of questions to determine the truth of my theory, then all of them should pretty much be saying something similar, or the same thing over and over and over again. So if I say, if you hold an intention, you tell this kind of story, you constantly go in and out of a transcendental state, and you constantly do this with subconscious instincts and things like that, and they follow my directions, I should notice these people over and over again saying, oh yeah, I felt this emotion more, or this was the type of story I was telling in my head, and this and that. They should keep saying it over and over. They shouldn't be doing something my theory says shouldn't really happen if it's true, right? They shouldn't be saying, oh, I didn't feel myself entering a transcendental state, I didn't feel any type of emotion increase, or my emotion jumped here and then went back, or whatever. That shouldn't happen if my theory is true. So that's basically how you would analyze subjectively verifiable phenomena, right? You should see a trend in the reporting data, right? And I call that semi-empirical data, because what it is it's not 100% empirical, because 100% empiricism completely removes anybody's personal opinion or this or that, right? Personal beliefs or anything. I can't, for subjectively verifiable phenomena, I can't study it without appealing to, without going through a person's personal opinion and preferences and things like that. But if we assume these people are telling the truth and they're articulating their ideas sufficiently well, we can't know if that's true. But if we assume it's true, then we should expect that they're going to say the same things over and over and over again, because there is a truth in the subjective realm, if you will, that is completely invariant to personal opinion. It has nothing to do with what a person believes or wants to be true. So if they can verify this truth, nothing's going to change about it. It's going to be the exact same thing from person to person to person to person to person, right? So they should say the same thing over and over and over and over again, regardless of who they are, what they believe in, how they grew up, or whatever, right? Same thing true for objectively verifiable phenomena, right? If reality operates in a way that's predicted by some theory, so some objectively true way, and it doesn't matter who's performing the experiment, where they are on the planet, what day it is, unless that's important to theory, but for physics, it shouldn't matter what day it is or any of that, right? The reality should operate according to the same rule all the time. Same thing's true for subjectively verified phenomena. For example, your subconscious. Doesn't matter what a person believes, how they grew up, what their religious beliefs are, none of it makes any difference, right? If you tell them to do certain things, they should have the same experience all the time. So I know I'm beating a dead horse with that, but I wanted to make that clear. So, and so that's why I call it semi-empirical data, because it includes unfortunately includes people's subjectivities and things like that, but it still has objectively true information. Whether it's subjectively verifiable or objectively verifiable, it makes no difference. It has objectively true information in the reporting data if you presume that everyone's telling the truth, articulating their ideas well, right? So I say all of that to say that this sort of process allows us to study subjectively true verifiable phenomena in a scientific way, right? This is the best you can do so if reality has limited certain information about itself, right, to subjectively verifiable phenomena, or to cases where it can only be verified subjectively, then if you're practicing true science, you're going to say, well, I don't like that limit. I don't like that I have to go through people and trust on their opinions and trust they're telling me the truth to get that objectively true information. But that's a limit reality's placed on me. I got no choice. I just have to accept it and do the best I can to get to try to figure out that true information anyway, right? That's what you would do if you're practicing actual science. And looking for semi-empirical data, so looking for trends and commonalities of reports from people or their personal testimony, that's also practicing proper science, right? Now, I argue that this is the proper scientific way to study the concept of God or to know more about God, right? Because he's willing to give us information about himself in the form of subjectively verifiable experiences. For whatever reason, he does tell us why. We do know the reason. I'll talk a little more about it in the next video. But for now, I'll just say for whatever reason, he doesn't seem to be willing or as willing to do it in an objective way. So if he's willing to do it in a subjective way, no problem. Then we just have to go to this different branch of science or this different form of science, and we can use science to know more about God. So we can set up a theory about God. We can make predictions about what's going to happen as you draw nearer to God and try to have a relationship with God. And we can verify that theory is true by our experience and experience of others. So I argue that's absolutely what you can do to know God. And that's what people do all the time, right? Now, this standard of science that I'm saying here, is it just something I'm conveniently making up in the case of God? No. This is the standard that they practice in all social sciences, right? You know why? Because in social science, they practice actual science, right? They don't do what the atheist does and just make up their own standard for what they want to be true or what counts as evidence. No, they accept the limits of information and reality, and they do the best they can to get that information otherwise. So in social sciences, they study subjectively verifiable phenomena. And what they do is they will ask people various questions and get their personal testimonies and get information about their lives to try to understand the truths of reality that are subjectively verifiable, right? So they do it in psychology, they do it in sociology, they do it in economics, they do it in marketing, right? When they're trying to figure out what makes a person want to buy things and things like that. They do it in philosophy, right? When it comes to like normal theories about the best way to live, like Eastern philosophy with Confucianism and even Taoism and things like that, right? All of these things are social sciences, but when we say social sciences, what we mean is they're not like physical sciences. But more specifically, what underlies the epistemology of the two, or the epistemological difference between the two, is that in physical sciences, you can study it using a particular process you can only do with it because it's an objectively verifiable phenomena. It consists of objectively verifiable phenomena. In social sciences, you're doing the same thing. You're using science to obtain some truth of reality, but now you have to do it in a slightly different way because those truths are only subjectively verifiable. They're still just as good. Their truth is just as good as physical truth. It's a truth of reality. Doesn't matter whether it's objectively verified or subjectively verified. Is subjectively verified. It's just that some of them can only be verified subjectively. There's nothing you can do about it. And so in social science, because they practice actual science, they do this exact thing that I'm saying, because that's science. That's how you would study subjectively verifiable things, right? And so like I said, right, God, because he allows himself to be known subjectively, we can use this approach to study God in a scientific way. And we can have a theory about God and demonstrate that relative to this standard here, so the same standards I told you, two standards I told you in the last video, combined with this standard. So if we speak to God, if we have a relationship with God, we should notice three things. We should notice things happen that we can't explain according to science, which is what happens when people come to God. So I forget where I left off, but yeah, so God is a subjectively verifiable phenomena. And if you do certain things that my theory predicts, right, which we're going to talk about all that stuff in the later videos, but if you have certain things that my theory predicts in terms of drawing near to God, drawing near to Jesus Christ, having a relationship with them, then you should notice that you'll have certain experiences that over time, maybe not right away, depends, it's different for each person, but you should have experiences you can't explain according to physical laws, right? But you'll have experiences that my theory predicts should happen, so you can make predictions, and you can verify those experiences by your experience. You can verify the concept of God, I should say, by your experience, and other people should have the same experiences. And according to that tenet, we also have to accept that we can't place random conditions on God just because we want it to be true and it's more convenient for us, right? We have to accept that God has limited our ability to obtain knowledge about him. If we're practicing science, then that we just have to accept it, work around it, and do the best we can, right? So that is the scientific way you would understand the nature of God, right? That is my theory and that is my prediction. And I believe that's already demonstrated. It happens all the time, right? So many people, when they come to God and they do certain things, they'll start having certain experiences with him, right? Now, again, we're going to talk about all that stuff in the later videos, but I believe you'll start to have experiences with God, and you can even understand other people's experience with God in Jesus Christ, right? And so what atheists do is what I call subjectivity fallacy. So to go over it here, it says subjectivity fallacy is the mistake of requiring objectively verifiable evidence for a subjectively verifiable phenomenon. So that is what atheists do. So when they say there's no evidence of God or there's no evidence of the supernatural, just remember what they're really doing is exactly what I said before, stars and stripes fallacy. They're placing a condition on God. They're placing a condition on reality as it relates to evidence, right? And this boils back down to what I talked about when it comes to laziness, right? It would be like, before I say it, let me bring up another example. So dark matter, for example. Dark matter is, I have to look up more about exactly what dark matter is. But my understanding is that they believe dark matter exists because of the motion of the galaxies, right? So when they look into the universe and they see the motion of the galaxies, they can't quite explain it according to our understanding of gravity, which is the main force presumably involved in the motion of galaxies. Well, yeah, the motion of galaxies and what happens with them, right? Something's missing, right? We can't quite explain it in terms of our current understanding of the nature of matter. It seems like there's something else there, right? Something else there that's causing the galaxies to do a certain thing. I should have looked it up, right? I actually forgot exactly what it is. I do know dark energy, I believe, causes the galaxies to expand. But I forget what it is with dark matter. But suffice it to say, I understand that the problem with dark matter and why it's called dark matter is because it just doesn't interact with light, right? It doesn't emit light at all, right? Now, this is something we're looking for that's very far away, right? So it'd be nice if it emitted light. That's how we know what's going on out there, right? It would be nice if dark matter, if it does exist, it would be nice if it just let us study it, right, by emitting light. But it doesn't want to do that, right? That's annoying for us, right? Can we say that, no, if dark matter exists, it must emit light and allow us to study it, or it can't exist at all? Of course not. That doesn't make any sense. That's not science, right? Now, you can make up whatever random condition of evidence for dark matter you feel like, but any random made-up standard, you can't just call science at the same time. You either pick the standard of science or you pick your own made-up standard, right? But it can't be both. And so that's why, that's what atheists do. When they say there's no evidence of God, what they really mean is that there's no evidence in a manner they would like it to be. They want to place a condition on God and say that in order for God to exist, he has to be willing to give them evidence in a way that's convenient for them, that allows them to not to have to do any work. They don't have to lift a finger, right, to know God, because God just gives them evidence in this form. Now they're willing to believe in him. Now they want to sort of follow him and follow Jesus Christ, which ultimately defeats the purpose, right? I'll talk a little more about that in the next video. But they want God to present evidence of himself as an objectively verifiable phenomenon, right? So they want it to be that you could put something on a table, measure it with instruments, and say, according to this, I can say God exists. There's only one, which is that subjectivity fallacy. There's only one problem. God is not a sort of automaton, sort of matter in nature or energy. It doesn't just function randomly, or it doesn't just function according to some automated rule. He's a being with free will. He could just choose not to give you information for that reason. In fact, you don't even know exactly what I said with the evil deity fallacy. if we recognize that God, if he exists, has more knowledge and understanding than us, infinitely more, then there could be a reason why he doesn't do that, which is the more moral, righteous, and truthful thing to do. We don't have all truth. We don't know why God doesn't do that. Well, we do know. He tells us, right? I'll talk about more in the next video. But from an atheist perspective, they don't know why God doesn't do that. For whatever reason, he chooses not to give us evidence of himself in that form, and he does it in the form of subjectively verifiable phenomena, right? I have free will. There could be certain truths about me that I'm just not willing to tell you or give to you, right? It would be hard for you to get it from me. You know why? Because I have free will. I could simply choose not to do it in the way you want or in the way that would be more convenient for you, right? So what atheists do is they don't recognize that fact. And like I said, it comes from laziness, right? Mostly comes from being lazy, right? They want God to present himself to them in a way where they don't have to really do any work, which is the same thing of physics, right? How much do we know about the laws of physics, right? And the laws of, and I always say physics, but technology, computer science, chemistry, biology, medical science, metallurgy. We know so much about all of these concepts and we benefit from them. I can go to YouTube or Wikipedia or whatever and just start looking up a whole bunch of information about any of these disciplines that I went to and just learn about it. Now, did I go through the work of studying this and running experiments to obtain this data and coming up with the theory? No, I didn't do any of that, right? In a sense, I could benefit from other people's work, right? So I can obtain all this knowledge without really doing that much work. Right now, am I doing work in terms of studying? Yes. Is that anywhere near the work that was involved in actually coming up with these theories and running experiments? No, it's not even close, right? I'm literally just coming at all the way at the very end after a whole bunch of people did all the work, and I'm just sort of profiting off of it, right? By learning it. Atheists want God to give them evidence in that way, right? Give them evidence in a way where he just gives it to them, and now it's like, oh, now I believe he exists, God exists, because he presented himself to me in a way that didn't require me to really do much work to believe in him. Something was put on a table. I measured it with instruments and said, "Oh, God exists." Right? We can perform this measurement or this experiment in a reproducible way across a planet. So everyone has a spirit now that proves God exists. So now everyone believes in God. No, that is the opposite of how God wants it. That's why That's why he doesn't give evidence in that way. Right? And when you actually learn to speak to, we're going to talk about this later, but when you learn to speak to God, he says it all the time anyway, but you're going to learn that is why he does things the way he does it. But for an atheist, like I said, they don't like that. It's too much work for them. They want God to just do it in a way where they don't have to do any work, right? That's annoying. It's inconvenient to actually have to work to know God. They're used to just benefiting off everyone else's work when it comes to knowledge, right? So they think God has to be the same way. No, right? So just recognize that when they say there's no evidence of God, that's not true. There's plenty of evidence of God. There's evidence of God all over the place. He tells us about himself all the time, right? What they mean is their own personal opinion about what would convince them, their own personal preference of evidence, right? Again, they'll try to convince you, oh no, we're doing it in the form of science. No, they're not, right? Because if you're doing it in the form of science, then you have to tell me why God, in order for God to exist, he has to give you evidence in an objectively verifiable form. Why? He seems to be willing to give it to us in a subjectively verifiable form. So he does it. Based on that, we could say he exists. I'm not just assuming, I'm not doing what they do. I'm not just assuming that he must exist. And even though I can't verify his nature objectively, well, that doesn't prove he doesn't exist, so he must still be there. That's the kind of silly nonsense God of gaps argument they always try to appeal to, which is just projection. That's what they do with science of gaps, right? No, even though if he doesn't give us information in an objective way, it seems completely the case that he's given us information in a subjectively verifiable way. Okay, I'm just going to use that approach to start studying him from this sort of context of science, from this scientific approach, is exactly what they do in social sciences. I argue if you do that, you can learn all types of things about God. So it perfectly follows the standard of science. You can know God in a scientific way and have lots of evidence of him. And there's plenty of evidence of him. There's evidence, people have evidence of him or obtain evidence it's all over the place, right? If you look up something on YouTube or Google about experiences with Jesus Christ, experience with God, they're all over the place. That's why he gives them to us, right? How could you possibly say there's no evidence of him with all these testimonies, right? But what they're doing is subjectivity fallacy. None of them count. None of those testimonies count. Like I said, all these people, they're all imagining it. They're all hallucinating. They're all on drugs, or they're all lying. And this is actually something that's actually very important that I forgot to mention in the last video. So like I said before, we know that these experiences, it is reasonable to conclude that these experiences aren't just hallucinations because they don't follow the same sort of behavior of random hallucinations, right? Like I said before, in pretty much all these experiences with God, now there may be some reported experiences that deviate from this because of human error, but I haven't seen any, right? So in the majority of reported experiences with God where they said they felt this great sense of love, God always told them to love others and behave in a righteous way and do this and do that, to do good things, right? If their theory was true, then it should be decently reported. In other words, like that's what I was talking about with semi-empirical data. In semi-empirical data, we see that God always tells people to do things in a certain way that we would call good, right? If their theory was correct and some random hallucination, right, God should be, sometimes, right, we should see a somewhat decent trend of people being told to live it up, right? Engage as much lust as possible, as much greed as possible, gain as much money as you can, indulge in whatever you can, don't worry about others, do you, or whatever, right? That's never told in near-death experiences, never, as far as I know, not near-death or not spiritual experiences either, right? It's never told. But that happens all the time in hallucinations, where people have experiences just based on whatever they want to be true or hope to be true, right? Jesus Christ, right? Jesus shows up in, again, not just near-death experiences, spiritual experiences as well. He shows up in a way that's completely inconsistent with this idea that's just, a matter of what you believe. Not true at all. He shows up to people who really who believe in other religions, right? They may know who he is, but in fact, I know of a case where someone said they didn't know who they were and who Jesus was at all, right? But Jesus appeared to them, right? And that happens all the time. It doesn't happen with any other religious figure, right? We don't see a reporting trend for any religious figure at all except for Jesus, right? In these experiences, in terms of cross-religious experiences. There's something, the semi-empirical data demonstrates the truth of Jesus Christ, right? And I can go on, right? These experiences, there's a truth to them, right? That we can analyze and understand and recognize through science. But, what I was going to say was that, another thing, this actually was what I really want to say, these experiences that people have with God, if they're simply a delusion or hallucination, right, then there should be certain biometric factors that we can look at, or biological factors that we can look at that should give us a prediction of who's going to have these hallucinations and experiences. But there isn't any, right? It's completely not, there's a word I use in the chapter 10 for it, but it's completely indeterminate according to those factors. It has nothing to do with them. It's invariant under those factors under biology. That's not true we know that for hallucinations and, mental illnesses, they are dependent on the physical body, right? So there is some degree of determinability for them based on genetics and your history and maybe if you got an injury, things like that. We don't see that for experiences with God at all. Everybody has experiences with God, right? There's no real way to predict when it's going to happen or you can't predict who it's going to happen for to a certain degree. This is for people who come to God, right? But ultimately, there's still a component of experiences with God that are completely unpredictable in terms of biology, right? It doesn't matter whether it's kids, whether it's old people, whether it's someone injured or not injured, whether someone believed in God or didn't believe in God, whether on this side of the planet or that side of the planet, whether we're talking about ancient times or modern times, it makes no difference. Everybody, there's a common reporting trend for people having experiences with God that match the same sort of components of in other words, certain components of the experience are completely consistent in all of these experiences, regardless of what a person believes, regardless of how they were raised, regardless of Like I said, other factors like what side of the planet they're on, whether they're in Asia or South America or North America, it makes no difference. Whether we're talking about today, 1,000 years ago, all of these experiences have the exact same consistencies. And you find them in the semi-empirical data, right? And what atheists believe, and this is part of materialism, in order for their theory to be true, literally all of these experiences have to be hallucinations, delusions, or imaginations, or whatever, or confirmation bias. All of it, literally not one, could be an example of God in order for the theory to be true. The same thing that has not only happened back then for thousands of years now, as far as we know, but it still happens today and continues to happen. People talk every day about experiences they've had with Jesus Christ and with God and things like that. And I know the atheists will say, oh, what about the people who've had experiences with other religious figures and things like that? Yeah, we talk about that in chapter 10. That has to do with the law of spiritual relativity, which we're going to talk about later. We see the same principle in the physics and the physical world with special relativity. That's not a reason for it not to exist. That's just some random condition you just made up in your head about why God has to be this way in order to exist, right? No, that's not practicing actual science. I'll actually get to that analysis. I'll go into that analysis a little more in a moment. But for an atheist, literally all those experiences still happen today, and for their theory to be true, all of them, right, which they still can't explain, right, have to be delusions. Like that. That's why I say atheists live inside a tinfoil hat, right? Because that's tinfoil hat logic. How's that any different? How's that not worse than a flat earther or an electric universer, right? These experiences continuously happen. They seem to follow there seem to be objective truths about these phenomena. They show up in the semi-empirical data all the time, right? It's completely consistent. It's not consistent at all with their idea of it being hallucination. They can't give us a better answer, right? Because they don't come up with a theory that makes predictions about these phenomena. They just engage in denialism. The dualist model has a much better prediction. It predicts all types of things, which we're going to talk a lot about that later, and it's consistent. Everything's consistent with the idea that God exists and that this is from God, right? They don't even try to make a theory that predicts anything. Now, if they can make a theory that made predictions they could perform an experiment, then that would be different. They don't even bother to do that. They make predictions all the way up into the point their prediction deviates from the dualist model. Then all of a sudden they don't make predictions and they'll just say this didn't happen for some reason. It was a hallucination or something and science will one day figure it out. That's nonsense. That's pseudoscience, right? That's anti-intellectual. Right? And so that's why, I say all that to say that that's basically how I believe should look at them. They're not engaging in science. What they're engaging in is complete nonsense, right? And that's exactly how I've always looked at them, right? So that's I just want to get that out the way. But ultimately, so when you hear them say there's no evidence of God, that's not true. They're just engaging in subjectivity fallacy. They just magically place some magical condition on God and say in order for him to exist, he must demonstrate himself in an objectively verifiable way or he can't exist at all. That when you ask them why God has to exist with that condition, they can never come up with an answer because what they're saying isn't well thought out. It's an intellectual argument. So they go over this point. It says, if God constructed reality in a way that causes many supernatural phenomena to be subjectively verifiable, then we'd see a bottlenecking of phenomena among seemingly supernatural phenomena. So what I mean by that is, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. So I said that it seems like there's a limit, right, God has placed on reality that has limited how we're able to obtain information about him, right? It would be nice, it would be convenient if he would allow us to know him in an objectively verifiable way, but he just doesn't seem to want to do that, right? Like similar thing with what I said about dark matter or dark energy, all right? But he does seem to be willing to do it in a subjectively verifiable way. Now, I haven't given proof that's the case. Nothing can really prove, there's no piece of evidence I can give to absolutely prove anything, right? So we talked about that earlier. However, if what I'm saying is correct, then there is a phenomenon you should at least see in reality, right? Which is the bottlenecking effect, right? Now that isn't a guarantee that I'm not proving that what I'm saying is the case about this limit of reality as it relates to God, but we should see a condition. If what I'm saying is true, then reality should at least have this condition. So it's possible for it to be true if it has this condition. It's impossible for what I'm saying to be true if we don't see this condition, right? So what is that? What do I mean by the bottlenecking effect? What is that condition? Well, what that means is if there are certain phenomena in reality that are in fact supernatural, which, like I said, they at least have the property that they can't be just explained in terms of physical laws, then we should see that in modern science, because there's so much science available today as opposed to 1,000 years ago, we should see that the more science learn about reality, there should be certain phenomena that they just aren't getting any closer to, right? You'll see like a bottlenecking effect. There's like information starts here, and there's all these things they're learning about reality and things like this, but it starts to slow down, and it starts to slow down, and then it just starts to sort of come to a halt almost. Like the window of things being learned about starts to close more and more and more the more you learn. And you'll see a bottlenecking effect when it comes to actually supernatural phenomena because it can't be explained in physical laws. So for the stuff I claim to be supernatural, right, you should see that bottlenecking effect. You should see that no matter how much science learns, right, about reality and what new theories people come up with and what new sort of experimental science scientists engage in, there should be certain phenomena that they're just not getting any closer to, right? Now, back in the day, there's plenty of phenomena that we learned more about the more as we were able to perform more sophisticated experiments and we came up with more sophisticated theories, right? But for supernatural phenomena, there really shouldn't be much difference now as there was 1,000 years ago because it's metaphysical, it's not physical. So do we actually see that bottlenecking effect in the real world? Well, yes, that's exactly what we see, right? That's what I talked about in the last video with the nature of consciousness, with the nature of emotions, the nature of dreams. Notice that we're no closer to explaining any of that stuff than we were 1,000 years ago. Now, I know you'll say, well, that's not true. We learned lots of stuff about the brain and about, it should be basically about the nature of the brain and how it affects the mind and emotions and behavior and things like that, right? That's neuroscience. That's not what I'm talking about, though. I'm talking about the supernatural component, right? Because the dualist model of reality predicts all of those things that scientists have discovered. I'm talking about, has science gotten any closer to explaining any things that the dualist model is saying is completely metaphysical, which is consciousness, emotions, dreams, things like that? Well, no, science hasn't come any closer to explaining any of that stuff, right? It is only explained the part that the dualist model says is relegated to the physical realm, right? It's explained all of it. Right? Now, those atheists might hear that and say, oh, you're saying a tautological cop-out, right? So anything that we can't explain is just magically metaphysical, and anything we can explain is just magically physical. No, right? I'm not you guys, right? I'm actually practicing science. So when I talk about the theory, the difference between metaphysical and, the material and dualist model, I'm talking about the theory of the subconscious, which I talked about all of book 1, and in the supernatural portion, we're going to talk about the rest of the chapters after this. So you're going to be able to make predictions about the natures of dreams. About the nature of dreams. You can have a theory and make predictions about them. You can make predictions about the nature of emotions, nature of thought. You can verify it through your own experience, and other people can too. You can manipulate your thoughts and emotions very easily. You can predict what's going to happen or how you're going to feel under certain conditions, whether there's certain changes in your body or you do certain things with your intention. So all of it, right? I'm not you guys. I'm actually following a theory. When it comes to God, you can make certain predictions about your experience with God and Jesus Christ, what's going to happen as you draw nearer to Him and you engage in certain things like not sinning and things like that, right? So no, right? I have an actual theory. I back it up with the foundation of axioms, right? I build upon those axioms, and so I can pinpoint exactly why, what my theory predicts, and exactly when it's going to make a prediction that deviates from the material model, right? What atheists hate is that their theory always fails when it makes a prediction that deviates from the dualist model, right? And so, like I said, if my theory is correct that supernatural phenomena exist and that there exists a being in this universe with the property that He created the universe, which is God, then we should see all of these events happening that are consistent with that belief in reality. And we should see, like I said, a bottlenecking effect where science, no matter how much it tries, is just not getting any closer to learning about certain phenomena, emotions, dreams, God, even the ability to move, right? Science is no closer than it was at the exact point where the material model predictions deviate from the dualist model is no closer than it was 1,000 years ago. You know why? Because it's metaphysical. That's why, right? That's why nothing science does is going to figure it out. That's why it's just like I said with Isaac Newton. When he was practicing so-called science, right? He's actually a great scientist, but when I say that, I'm talking about in the context of alchemy, right? So when he was practicing science when it came to alchemy, or trying to, he wasn't really practicing science. He might have told you that, right, if you asked him, but he was practicing, he was looking for evidence that matched his personal preference, right? So he was engaging in processes that would allow him to get evidence that meets his preference, not the standard of science. Because if you're practicing the standard of science, you would have recognized that the evidence shows that alchemy doesn't exist. So it's the same thing here with atheists, right? The science shows that supernatural phenomena exist, right? The science shows that God exists, right? Now, before I get into it, what they say is they're looking for evidence that just meets their own random made-up standard they just make up in their head. Anyone can do that. Like I said, I can make anything exist or not exist by that standard, right? But if I'm practicing science, and this is what atheists aren't doing, they would tell you that they are, but like I said, I won't get into it, that's a whole thing. But like I said, you can either have your personal preference or science, but not both. Now, if they just admit that, I'm not engaging in science, I'm engaging in my faith-based religion, which is what it is, right? And I have faith that materialism is the answer, right? I have faith that what I don't know will one day be explained by science. It is not logical to believe that from the perspective of science, but that is my faith. No problem. Just admit that that's what you're doing, because then that's different, right? It's just a religion, it's not science. You're not claiming it to be science anymore. No problem. Then you have faith in materials. That's fine, right? How's that any different for people who have, well, it is different for people who have faith in God because they're actually practicing science, right? But not everybody looks at it in scientific form when they do that. Certainly some faiths in God are not based on science, right? So it's no different. The problem comes when atheists pretend that what they're doing is scientific or logical. It isn't, right? And I hate when they do that, right? No, you're just engaging in random faith, right? We see the bottlenecking effect. You're no closer to explaining any of this stuff than you were 1,000 years ago, referring to the moment that the two models deviate, but you still, for whatever reason, believe that magically all this information is hiding and magically we'll find it one day. That's faith, right? You're doing something no different than Isaac Newton did with alchemy, right? It's not science. So the other thing I wanted to say, actually before I move on, is that now when I say there's a being that exists in this universe with the property that they created the universe, which is God, right? Can I prove that to be the case? No. But if my theory is true, we should see a consistency, right? We should see a whole bunch of experiences that seem to lend themselves to the truth that there does exist a being with this experience. And like I said, we see that all the time with spiritual experiences, supernatural experiences, experiences with God, things like that. Those things shouldn't really happen in a universe that doesn't have this being, right? We should only see mental illnesses and hallucinations with no real reporting trends, semi-empirical data that can't be explained in terms of physical laws and biology. That's what we should see. As always, the atheist model, or the materialist model, fails, because we don't see that, right? We see these reporting trends of spiritual experiences that don't follow biological factors at all and can't be explained in terms of them. They're all completely consistent with the idea that this universe has a being with the property that they created it. So that's God, right? And so what atheists will do is they'll look at any one of these experiences and say, oh, well, that doesn't necessarily prove that God exists. Or, oh, this supernatural experience, this out-of-body, let's say it's a near-death experience. People have them all the time. Oh, well, we don't really know what's going on, and maybe that doesn't necessarily prove that a being called God exists or whatever. Or a person has out-of-body experience. No, that doesn't really prove that a being called God exists or supernaturalism exists. Or we see the nature of emotions. We can't explain them in terms of biology, but we can't explain them in terms of the subconscious, and we presume the subconscious is metaphysical. Oh, that doesn't really prove that there's anything supernatural or that God exists. Who knows? It could be this and that about the brain that we just don't know yet. One day science will figure it out. Or I forgot to mention, there was even a guy who was blind, right? And I think there's more than one. I should have looked up his name, but it's easy to find them. A guy who was blind who had a near-death experience, and guess what? He was able to see. Should be impossible to happen. I think he was blind from birth, so it wasn't just that he lost his sight at some point. I'll try to look up the experience, his name. But that happened. He was able to see for the first time. Oh, that doesn't really prove anything. He could be lying, and, it could be this and that. And you'll notice this over and over and over again, right? If any one experience true doesn't necessarily prove that God exists, but you keep seeing experiences over and over and over and over again that are all consistent with this idea that there is a being named God, he exists, and he has a property that he is good. He never tells people to do evil things, even hellish experiences. People go there when they've done bad things. There aren't people who do good and do wonderful things and behave in love and go there anyway. These experiences don't tell us that that's what happened. That seems to tell us God is good, right? They're all consistent with this idea. What atheists do is they will always appeal to denialism. You can't give me absolute evidence. Now, they don't make any predictions, and you'll notice that all of their belief, they always appeal to something not being absolute proof. There's no consistency to their beliefs. Everything we expect in a universe that's materialistic, we don't see those things. There's no consistency to those ideas. There's all types of things that violate those ideas all the time, right? If their model was true, we should see consistent things that over and over and over lend themselves to the truth of their model. But we don't get that, right? That's why there's all these things that they have to contend with being unable to explain. That doesn't happen in dualist model at all. We can explain all of it. Right? We can explain dreams, we can explain consciousness, we can explain near-death experiences, we can explain spiritual experiences, we can explain life after death. We can explain all this. It's no problem for us. It's easy, right? They're the ones who have this problem where there's always these things they can't explain, and they always have to appeal to one day science will figure it out, which is science of gaps and this and that, right? And so atheism is fundamentally just a form of denialism, right? When they were faced with all these problems, they just engage in denialism, pretend it didn't happen for some reason, and say one day science will figure out, which it isn't science, right? And the way they usually contend with these spiritual experiences that they see is they'll always place some random condition on it to say, oh, it didn't exist because if it were real, it would have this condition I just randomly made up in my head, right? Like I remember there's one guy who said near-death experiences, well, how can they be real? Why don't more people have them? Why are there such a small amount of people have them? Okay, so now we presume that if God exists, right? If these experiences are coming from God or higher spiritual beings, so now if they're willing to give people these experiences, they have to be doing it with a large number of people or they can't be doing it at all. Nonsense, right? They're just placing some random condition on it. And not to mention, they give us enough information to kind of tell us why these experiences happen. But, they'll just make some random condition up, and that's what they always do. I remember, one thing I also want to say is I remember I was debating this atheist online. I won't get into it too much because this video has been super long. But he was trying to say how if God exists, right, then you should have some way of demonstrating it. Now I'm telling him that I know of empirical evidence fallacy. I know all these things already, so I always sort of just navigate the debate using these principles, using these ideas. So I'm telling him there's no way that I can look at anything in the physical world and prove to you God exists. It's impossible. Right? And I asked him what does evidence look like or something. I forget how it's still in my history. I could look at it. But I asked him that at some point. But eventually we got to the point where he was saying how if physical laws exist, so he was saying how if God exists, then he must have some impact on reality that deviates from randomness. And I was like, that's actually true. I agree with that. Right? And so he was like, okay, what is your evidence that this is the case? Now, God is a subjectively verifiable phenomenon, so I'm like, okay, you can know that by virtue of people's experience with him, right? You will literally see that people who would claim to have a strong relationship with God or be born-again Christians, we'll talk about them a lot in the later chapters, you would see that they mention certain things that are generally different from other people, and you'll notice it's trendlining semi-empirical data of their reports. And he was saying how, I was telling him how the problem with this is exactly what I said, human error, right? You can't really know who actually has a relationship with God and who doesn't, right? Now, if you understand the theory of God, which I'm going to talk about much later, then you can have a better sort of methodology of discerning between people who just claim to have a relationship with God and people who actually do. And by the way, I should mention, that's another thing atheists do. They will always put all people who claim to be religious in the same box, right? In other words, I remember, before I even get into it even more, there was another atheist I was debating. And he was saying how many people sort of claim, I was telling him how God never tells people to do basically evil things. And he was like, oh, that's not true. There are plenty of people who've done evil in the name of God or said God told them to do this and that. And I was like, see, notice what you did there, right? Now, to be fair, I'm not saying the whole debate, but I'm saying, I was telling him that there's a consistency to the experiences with God that we can say that, okay, these experiences probably are actually of God, right? Rather than someone just saying it. And what he did when I said that God never tells people to do evil in these experiences, he just made up some random condition about what the consistency of these experiences is. He just said that, anyone who claims God spoke to me, that's the consistency of all the experiences. That's not what I said. Why would that be the consistency? Of course, anyone could just say it and make it up. I could say that I have $1 million, right? Does that mean I actually do? If you want to do an analysis on millionaires, their lifestyle, how they feel, things like that, are you only going to go by people who claim to be a millionaire? Of course not, right? You're going to want to have some type of evidence that they're actually a millionaire. If you understand something about millionaires, you're going to be able to know what consistencies to look for to find out if someone's actually a millionaire, right? Like their bank account or their assets and things like that, right? If you actually understand the nature of God, you're going to know what consistencies to look for in people who actually have a relationship with God versus people who just claim it. But atheists, in their usual kind of lazy analysis, everyone who claims to speak to God it represents what it means to have a relationship with God. No, that doesn't make any sense. That's not science. That's what they always do, right? They'll always do that when it comes to experiences with God. They go on the most simple, meaningless, sort of bare bones sort of claim, right? And then it's like, okay, everybody, this has to be thrown in category of people who have a relationship with God and this is how God affects them. No, that doesn't make any sense. So just know that atheists do that too. They usually will place some random, like I said, stars and stripes fallacy. They place some random condition on reality. And if God speaks to people, basically everyone who claims to speak to God, then that's free data in sort of what it means to have a relationship with God. It can't just literally be that someone made it up. And I was telling him, I was like, okay, so is your contention that a universe can either have people that actually speak to God, or it can have people that only think they speak to God but actually aren't, but it can't have both. It can only be one or the other, but not both, right? We can't just have a universe that has some people that actually speak to God and some people who just think they are or know they aren't, but just claim it, right? It's impossible to have, they're mutually exclusive. Both of them can't be in the same universe at the same time. Why? Of course, he ignored me, didn't answer that question. That's how they usually behave. That's what usually happens when I ask them certain questions like that. But again, it's just these kind of sort of lazy analysis that don't make any sense just because they know their ideas, their beliefs about reality are nonsense. They make no sense. They're not scientific, right? So I just want to mention that. That's another thing that they will often do. But going back to the guy I was talking about, he was saying, I was telling him how it's difficult to know who actually has a relationship with God and who doesn't. Now, I can't explain to him this whole theory in that short time. So I was telling him, well, just focus on the people who claim to speak to God and who are born-again Christians. Now, there will still be some margin of error. Yes, some people will claim to speak to God even though they don't. Or some people will claim to be born-again Christians even though they're not. But people who would at least claim it, that's probably your best chance to get information from people who actually speak to God. And I said those people are generally going to be more happy or probably be more likely to report greater happiness. And even going around their reporting, you could probably look for certain metrics in their reporting about their lifestyle and their goals, things like that, that would reflect if they actually are of God. And you would see that reported in semi-empirical data. In other words, you would see a trend that really shows there's something about God himself or people who speak to God that is different from everyone else, right? Something unique. So I told him that, and he pulled up some random survey or something about religious people. And what's amazing, it actually proved what I said, right? It said that religious people who describe themselves as more religious are generally happier than people who aren't. And I was like, exactly. But here's the thing. I was telling him, but this survey doesn't really do what I was telling you. Right? I said, look for people who speak to God and born-again Christians. You found some random survey about people who would claim they're religious. That doesn't mean anything. There are plenty of people who are religious, don't have a relationship with God. In fact, the Bible talks about that. Right? But even still, what I was telling him is if you the data, because you only picked people who are religious, that's obviously going to skew the data, because there's going to be many people in that data who don't actually have a relationship with God, but some of them do. That's why the data proves my claim just a little bit. If you take those people out and do what I actually said, you're going to notice the data supports my claim way more than that thing did, which it already did anyway. And then what he was saying was, oh, you're, why do I have to do that and this and that? I'm like, why? He was basically saying that I was trying to, I'm trying to remember, he was saying that I was trying to sort of, I guess, put conditions on the reporting data. I was like, no, I'm not. Like, I'm making a theory. This is my claim. It doesn't matter what, oh no, he was trying to say that I was biased or something, or putting my opinion into it. I'm like, it's my claim. It doesn't matter whether it's my bias or my opinion or anything, right? Who cares about that? If it's my claim, right, and I say this is how you test it, then that's what you got to do to test it. It doesn't matter whether it's inspired by my opinion or personal belief or anything, right? And I was telling him how if you don't want to test my claim in the manner I've said, which I said this is how you would prove God, then no problem. You don't think it's worth testing. But then you can't say there's no evidence of God. I gave you the means of testing for evidence of God, and you chose not to use it, right? You can't have the means of finding evidence of God and then just say, I don't feel like doing that. Okay, now there's no evidence of God. No, that doesn't make, well, he's an atheist, so that doesn't surprise me, but that doesn't make any sense. But then when I was telling him about, I was like, okay, God is known. You can know God through personal experience. He's like, oh, well, personal experience could be, it basically could just be a person's own hallucination or delusion, so you can't trust it and this and that. So I'm like, okay, if something is not allowed to be known or accepted through personal experience, I'm like, why do you accept the existence of emotions? I should be able to treat you any way I feel like, because you don't have emotions. It's not hurting you. You don't care. There's no such thing as you. By your standard, I should not treat you like you have emotions because we can't prove it. In other words, you can't prove an emotion in an objective way. You can't put an emotion on a table and demonstrate its existence. He was like, no, that's not true. You could use biological data to demonstrate the nature of emotion. I'm like, okay, you can have biological data, but how do you know that data matches onto an emotion? It doesn't matter how high my hormones are, it doesn't matter how much my pain receptors are firing or how much dopamine is in my brain. It's no difference. How do you know any of that corresponds to the experience of some type of emotion? You only know through the semi-empirical data, right? Through the reporting data. At some point, some scientists said when this happened, so when these nerves were firing or these hormones were in the blood in this high amount or whatever, some scientists said, okay, how do you feel, right? And then they told them. And they saw a trend in the personal testimony, right, enough times to say, oh, when this part of the body is doing this experience is happening. In other words, they studied it. So this is even neuroscience or psychology. They studied it, used subjectively verifiable phenomena using this form or standard of science, right? Because that's how you would study it. So I was telling him you could do the same thing with God. You would look at the personal testimonies of people who claim to have a relationship with God, right, or born-again Christians, and you would notice a reporting trend. So I was like, so in other words, what he was saying was that, first of all, he ignored my question when I told him that. So he was saying, there's no such thing as emotions. I'm like, okay, how do you know an emotion exists outside of other people's personal testimony? Now, you're saying personal individual testimony for yourself doesn't count, which I agree with. That's not good enough to be a standard for knowing something. So you verifying your own emotion isn't good enough. But you can't verify the emotion of others in a completely objective way. You can't do it without appealing to their own personal testimony. So by your standard, emotions don't exist. I can treat you however I want to. That's obviously what they're doing is a contradiction, because of course atheist logic is of course a contradiction, because it doesn't make any sense, right? It's inconsistent. If emotions exist, then I argue God exists by the same exact standard, right? So I just wanted to mention that. So like I said, the video is really long. So I just want to get to this last point. So the next thing I want to talk about is this point, which says, physics shows that reality does not completely function in a way that is independent of the observer. And so what I'm getting at there is basically I just kind of want to bring everything home to this idea that there's a such thing as absolute evidence or some purely objective evidence, right? I argue there's really no such thing as a purely objective evidence, right? You can just get away with it more in a sort of perspective that we have of reality. So for example, and I mentioned it with special relativity, right? Special relativity really only becomes important or meaningful to discuss when you're moving at speeds that are, you could say to some degree, are close to the speed of light, right? The closer you get to the speed of light, the more relativistic phenomena starts to present itself, the more it starts to become important in your calculations and in your considerations. When you're not moving at speeds comparable to the speed of light, you could completely ignore any factors. Like in mathematics, there will be certain relativistic factors, right? You completely ignore them, they're all virtually zero and have no real effect on your answer. So you can then just use the laws of classical mechanics and the mathematics of classical mechanics, right? But just because it's virtually zero, the effects of the strength of relativistic effects are virtually zero when you're not moving near the speed of light, doesn't mean they don't exist, right? They are still there, right? In other words, in relativity, we see that the laws of physics, right? Well, relativity says that the laws of physics are the same in every reference frame. But more specifically, the fact that the speed of light is the same in every reference frame means that either time is going to dilate or length is going to contract in terms of the things I'm measuring. But more specifically, it just means that I can get certain measurements, right? I can measure certain values, like we talked about before, the non-relativistic kinetic energy of an object. What value I measure will actually depend on me, right? Not necessarily my beliefs, no, but it's going to depend on certain factors about me as it relates to how I'm moving relative to the speed of light. In other words, it's my measurements, what I measure is not completely independent of certain properties about myself, right? Now, it becomes taking that factor into consideration becomes more of an issue as I'm getting closer to the speed of light, but it does still exist even now. So my experience of time, if someone across the world asks me what time it is, or someone across my town, just to make it closer, we're in the same time zone, they ask me what time it is, and I tell them, I can get away with presuming that we are experiencing time in the same way, or according to the same, we can basically count time in the same way. But that's not really true. Time functions differently for me than this person, right? Not just in my mind, the clock will actually count differently. In other words, reality does change depending on the observer. It isn't completely objective. And if you did somehow get people to move near the speed of light in different sort of fractions of the speed of light, then you would get them having wildly different calculations, right? For non-relativistic calculations. I can get a kinetic energy of, let's say, like I said, 5 joules. Another person could get 8 joules. Another person can get 7 joules. That's completely different. But everything they observe about this object will be completely consistent with what they have calculated in their reference frame, as long as they maintain the same constant velocity and the object they measured maintains constant velocity, right? But that's strange, right? How can this object have a different kinetic energy, right? How can it both have 6 joules, 7 joules, and 8 joules, or whatever I said, at the same time? It doesn't make any sense, right? Well, that's reality, right? That's what, in science, we recognize that as we go further and further and further away from our limited perspective of reality, which is extremely limited, how we perceive reality in the conditions that we tend to live in is very limited, right? We recognize as we go further away from that condition, to extreme conditions, you could say, right? We recognize that certain laws of physics are easier to see. They present themselves more. And then they start to get weirder and weirder and weirder. And they start to go against what our intuition tells us, right? So that's an example of one of them, right? At speeds close to the speed of light, an object will have multiple different kinetic energies. Now, the way they get around that in special relativity is they say, okay, look, there's no absolute reference frame on how to define this thing's kinetic energy. So what we're going to do is we're just going to pick a reference frame we can all agree on, right? And that one is called That's the one you would use for proper time and proper length and things like that. But it's basically the reference frame moving the object you're measuring is seen at rest, right? That's the rest frame, right? So that's just one everyone can agree on. Even that itself is not an absolute reference frame. There's nothing special about that reference frame compared to any other frame, right? That's just the one that, nature is convenient for us because apparently nature gave us a reference frame that everyone can agree on. So that's nice. So that's the one we use. But ultimately, there is no reality, there is no completely objective measurement or empirical data in reality that we can use. This is my claim, right? That is completely devoid of personal experience and personal preference, is completely devoid of the person performing the measurement, right? In other words, reality changes to some degree based on us. And we see the same thing in quantum mechanics. Now, I know quantum mechanics is not, what I'm going to say is not considered relativity. I know, right? It's completely different. But I'm just saying, in this context, it kind of proves my point. So in quantum mechanics, when you try to measure an object, it exists in some sort of state, right? Some sort of foggy state of superposition before we measure it. But after we measure it, now it has a value. Now it's showing us something. We couldn't really see what it was doing before that. In other words, there's an observer effect, right? By trying to observe the object, we changed it, right? We affected it. So reality changed in some way based on something we did, right? And we like to think that we can take measurements about reality without significantly really changing it in any way. So it's completely objective. That's not true, right? All of reality changes to some degree based on us. And basically what I'm getting at there is our experience, as we go further and further away from the physical realm, we see this, I believe we're going to see this principle even more in the spirit realm. So when we go into the spiritual realm, reality especially changes according to the observer, right? And now an atheist would say, oh, they don't like that. They don't like that reality in some way has to be verified by virtue of the personal testimony of the person. They want it to be verified in a way that kind of has nothing to do with their personal testimony. You could put it on an instrument and measurement. But we recognize that that's not done even in regular physics. All of reality, all of our measurements are changed to some degree by the observer, right? What I observe is different from another person observe. It's personal to me, right? Again, even in physics, to some degree that exists. Now you can rule out those sort of relativistic factors. They're not large enough to matter when you're not moving near the speed of light, but they're still there, right? In quantum mechanics, you can, if you accept that you're just not going to understand what's really happening about an object before you measurement, then there isn't an issue. If you just accept it as an observer, you're going to impact the object such that it's always going to pick a value and you're never going to know what was really happening before that, then no problem, right? But now those are extreme conditions. When you go to another extreme condition, even more so than those, which is the spirit realm, you're going to see the same effect, right? Reality is going to change in a certain way that's unique to the observer, right? There is no way to really get information in a way not affected or not unique, that's not unique in some way to the observer, right? That's what the atheist wants, but not only can you not do it in the spirit realm, you can't even do that in this physical realm. You just get away with it, not doing it more. Right? And so the atheist does is they place that condition, that rule on reality. I want you to present evidence to me in a way that's completely independent of the observer, right? So that I know that I'm not corrupting the data or changing it in any way, but that isn't really how reality works. They're just placing a random condition on reality that's more convenient for them. It's easier, right? I want it to be done this way. No problem. Just stop calling it science because it isn't science. They don't even do that in physical science, right? So that's my claim, right? That's what I believe atheists do. And again, because they're not practicing science, they're just engaging in a personal preference. No problem. If you want to do that, fine. Then call what you're doing a preference or call it faith or religion and stop calling it science because it isn't, right? So that's basically it. So I just wanted to go through that. This video is also really long. But like I said, that's why I didn't want to put it all in a single video. But like I said, I argue that pretty much these main fallacies we looked at in this chapter, almost any atheist argument you hear fundamentally is going to fall into one of these categories, one of these fallacies, right? But the last thing I want to talk about, and I just put this here to remind myself, so make sure I don't forget, just two other things I want to mention, because I forgot to mention them last video. These are just two kind of silly arguments that atheists will come up with that I've heard before, which I'll just kind of go through that here as well. So it's this concept of predeterminism, right? So what that means, and I was debating with atheists about this, he was saying how can we really have free will if God already knows the future, right? So people don't really have free will. I'm like, why? Why would knowing the future mean we don't have free will? So he was like, oh, well, can you choose to do something that deviates from the future that God has seen? And I'm like, no. And he's like, exactly. So your will is not really free. I'm like, no, that doesn't mean anything. That's complete non sequitur. So I'm like, okay, what he's doing, because I've heard this enough times, I've never seen this as a rational argument. I don't know why they think it's a big deal. I'll just mention this though. So I'm like, first of all, so your claim is that if God sees the future, so someone knows what someone's going to do in the future, your claim is that it is a necessary condition. By necessity, if you know the future, then by definition, a person's will is restricted because of what you know. I'm like, I don't accept that. Why? Explain to me why knowing the future necessitates that a person's will is now restricted and can't choose different things. And he's like, because it can't choose something against it can't choose something against what you know the future to be. And I'm like, so, right? It's not that it can't choose something against the future so much as it's not going to, right? In other words, the freedom of one's will, it is perfectly possible for it to be completely intact and know what it's going to choose or know the future at the same time. You're arguing that the free will is restricted and must now adjust itself to match what the future is doing, right? The bias on the freedom of one's will, or the bias on one's will, is forcing it to adjust itself to match the future. That's not true. You haven't established why that must necessarily be the case. Of course, it is perfectly possible for the freedom of one's will not to be affected at all, to have no bias on it at all, to completely be free and know the future at the same time. There's no reason why both of those can't be true. So that's kind of a silly argument of predeterminism. When you hear a person say that, just ask them why knowing the future necessitates the restriction of one's will. Why can't it be free and I know the future at the same time? And the free will have no restrictions on it. Right? That's a strange causality, which of course they can never explain because they're complete non sequiturs. And so the last thing I want to talk about, I just put absolute understanding there, but this other thing that people do, so I'm Christian, right? I believe in Jesus Christ. Jesus is King of Kings, right? So another thing I noticed, this is what they do with the Bible. I see this all the time. Now, I'm not crazy. I mention it later in the later videos I recorded. I haven't read the Bible like crazy yet. So I want to read it. I've just been too busy, but I want to start reading it more. And I mentioned in later videos too, and I have started reading it, but I haven't gone far into it yet. What a lot of people who criticize, I talk more about this also in chapter 4, but what a lot of people do criticize the Bible is something that just doesn't make any sense to me. So this is atheist, right? So they'll say, oh, the Bible is full of contradictions, and, in the Bible it says this, so how could God be real, or how can you believe in Jesus Christ? What evidence do you have of Jesus? And this and that, and they'll go on and this and that, right? The Bible says this, how could Satan exist if there was no sin in heaven, and he wasn't allowed to sin, and this and that, and, where did the people in Genesis come from if it was just Adam and Eve? And by the way, there's experiences that answer that question too. I think Ivan Tuttle, 44 hours, and they both answer that question. The atheists will just ignore them, of course, and pretend pretend those things don't exist, and going back to saying God never spoke to anybody we don't know. But what they'll do is say that because the Bible says this, it can't be true, and there's no reason to believe in Jesus Christ. I'm like, okay, so first of all, on top of the Bible already telling you that's not how you're supposed to interpret it or read it, which I talk more about that in chapter 4, let's say that you're right. Let's just give you that. You're telling me that because of what you think the Bible is saying, all these people who have had experiences with God and with Jesus Christ that have been happening as far as I know, since the beginning of time, right? I've had experiences with Jesus. Other people have had experiences with Jesus. I've had supernatural experiences with Jesus Christ. Many people have them. They have them every day. Again, it seems like they have been having them since the beginning of time. There's all types of other evidence for Jesus Christ, right? So all of that magically now didn't happen for some reason. Retroactively, we have taken it out of existence, right? Because of your interpretation of these one or two passages in the Bible, and because based on your interpretation are a contradiction. Nonsense. Like, I don't know what, like, anyway, right? Like, that is what some atheists do, right? I see that too, right? Because my belief in Jesus and my belief in God is not really based on what the Bible's saying, right? And I talk about this in later videos. I came to realize that much of the Bible is true, right? If not all of it, because of my experience with God, because of my relationship with Jesus Christ and what the information that has been revealed to me. I didn't even really know much. I didn't know much about the Bible. Didn't think much about it. It was only later when I started to learn more about God that I was like, oh, all this stuff in the Bible seems to be true. Like, I kept seeing new things in the Bible that matched up exactly with my understanding of God. It was already in there, I just didn't know it, right? That's when I started to believe in the Bible. And then God actually told me to read the Bible personally. And so the reason I believe in God isn't based on just what some holy book says. It's based on me actually studying God and trying to learn about him through science, right? Through the science. The science is what has verified the Bible to me. Atheists will always try to contextualize it as, oh, you just believe in God because of you read some book and that's the only piece of evidence you have. No, it isn't. There's plenty of evidence all over the place, especially when they talk about hell, right? Oh, hell is just something in the Bible. You would never believe in outside. That's not true. There are plenty of people who have had experiences with hell. There are even non-Christians who have hellish experiences, right? And of course, they'll just dismiss these experiences. Oh, they're hallucinations. They don't follow any of the properties of other hallucinations. But for some reason, they're still hallucinations, even though we can't explain the science. One day we'll figure it out, right? So the same thing they always do. There's always some reason why what happened didn't really happen. So I just wanted to mention that. So it's kind of a silly sort of thing to pretend that the only reason people believe in Jesus is because of what some book said, right? A holy book, right? There's plenty of evidence of Jesus outside of the holy book. That's actually why the testimony people give of their experience with Jesus Christ, they're supposed to give it. That's what God wants. And that helps people to, well, we'll talk a little more about this in the next video, but that helps people to believe. That's what God wants. God doesn't want you to just blindly believe in him with no kind of evidence at all. Atheists always try to make it sound like that's what people are doing because that's what they're doing, right? They have to deny everything, right? Everything didn't happen. Nothing happened, right? That supports this idea of God. So when you see all of these experiences, all of them didn't really happen and we don't really know, and it could have been this and it could have been that, right? It's always something it always could be something else, right? It's never just a thing that's consistently demonstrated over and over and over again. And of course, then they'll say, oh, well, what about this hallucination? And this was really a hallucination. And this was, so then they're just making predictions that line up with the dualist model that don't deviate from it. And they'll try to use that to say why these experiences are, like I already kind of said it already, they'll kind of make what's in mathematics called the equivalence relation. They'll just pick some random equivalence relation between all types of experiences and say, oh, they're all of God. No, if you have actually a theory on how God works from practicing actual science, you know what properties a testimony is going to have that's actually of God and which ones aren't, or if they're supernatural experiences. It gives you a better ability to differentiate between people who just claim it versus people who actually have it. And they do the same thing in psychology. They do the same thing in sociology. There are certain metrics that they will build for a particular profile of an individual or a society. And they will say that if an individual reports this, we're not just going by what they simply said. There's a lot more will look like a criminal profile, for example. There's a lot more we look at to get a profile of this person's personality such that we can interpret what they're saying in this context. That's how you deal with subjectively verifiable phenomena or semi-empirical data. You wouldn't just go solely based on what someone said and that's it, and that proves the trend line. That's nonsense, right? They don't do that in psychology or marketing or philosophy. Atheists do that, though, when it comes to reports about God. If somebody says he spoke to God, everything what they say counts for everybody who talks about God, right? There's no discernibility between people who act like I said, people who actually speak to God and people who don't. Now, in order to get that discernibility, you have to understand more about the phenomena of God, which you do through science, which is not what they do. So anyway, right, I'm kind of beating a dead horse, but I just want to mention that too. So that's it. Like I said, I know the video is super long, but that's pretty much it for the chapter. So, well, for the fallacy. So in the next chapter, we kind of already went over it, but we're going to talk more about solving the problem of knowing God with that initial property, which, like I said, we already went over it, but I'll go over into it more in the next video. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.